describes and the conditions that he described really does not pertain to what we surmise must have been Ethiopian Jewish history at that time. So there is a reference here that some historians will rely on, but others regard as suspect. Then we have Benjamin of Tudela, much more reliable source, a famous Jewish traveler who made his way through much of the Jewish world, and he recorded in significant detail what exactly he saw. However, he never got to Ethiopia himself. He merely recorded what he had heard from others, and so there's some question as to the validity of his account of Ethiopia in particular. Nevertheless, there is significant reference to it. Rav Ovadia of Bartanura, also known as Bartanura, or simply the Rav, very important commentator on the Mishnah, writes about and needing to be redeemed by the Jewish community. Much more interesting kind of reliable source, which is certainly confirmed by the extensive writings of Rabbi David ben Abi Zimra, known as the Radbaz, an abbreviation in the 16th century. He was the preeminent rabbi of North Africa. He was very active in Cairo in particular, and he dealt with specific cases regarding people from Ethiopia, and he absolutely confirmed that they were Jews from the tribe of Dan. In particular, he dealt with the question of whether a slave woman coming from this region and claiming to be Jewish could be redeemed and then married, buy her out of slavery, and then was it possible for a Jew to marry her? And in fact, he ruled in the positive and was very supportive of the Jewish identity story of the Ethiopian Jew. Fascinating, and so Jews have known about the Ethiopian population for hundreds of years, long before James Bruce. We don't have really extensive historical data that describe the interactions of this population with other Jewish communities. Here's a map that shows precisely where the majority of the Jews in Ethiopia were located, around Lake Tana. And as you can see, the proximity to Saudi Arabia and Yemen is very significant. They're about 4,000 miles south of Israel, however. And I think we should turn now to the discussion of where did they come from? How do you get Jews in Ethiopia? They don't and the other patterns of migration that we know of Jews in Israel. According to the Kebra Nagas, which is a medieval account of the history of Ethiopia, the entire Ethiopian royalty comes from Israel. Echoing the account in the Hebrew scriptures, the Queen of Sheba, which is located just to the east of Ethiopia across the Red Sea, traveled to Israel and met King Solomon. Then she returned, and this time to Ethiopia, and she was expecting a son by King Solomon, who was named Menelik, and he formed the beginning of the Ethiopian royalty. So, ironically, Ethiopians regard themselves as Israelites, particularly because of this particular connection. In the oral traditions of Ethiopian Jewry, this was one of the several stories that account for their existence. There is, however, no other data to support this other than the oral tradition. There are similar oral traditions which suggest that perhaps the Ethiopian Jews were a break-off from those Jews who left Egypt in the period of the Exodus, or perhaps the tribe of Dan from northern Israel, who successfully evaded the Assyrian invasion in the 8th century before the Common Era and made their way to Ethiopia. And all of these are kind of like legends that are lost in time and have no real way of validating. Other theories which may have a little bit more validity, or at least maybe a little bit more credibility, is the influence of Jews through Chimyar. You'll recall we spoke about them a few weeks ago. This is the kingdom in South Arabia that converted to Judaism sometime around the 4th, 5th century, and they had significant conflict with the kingdom of Aksum, which was based in what would be today called Ethiopia. So it's possible that maybe Judaism arrived in Ethiopia through the influence of the Chimyar, but what is without doubt is there is a certain population of people in Ethiopia who identify as as Jews. We'll see there's a little bit of a caveat on what that word actually means. Living within or alongside the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia. Here's a representation of the Christian kings speaking to Muslims. The historical data on the experience of these Jews is not fully fleshed out until much later, but it appears that they had some degree of self-rule. It's debatable whether they had a full kingdom of their own, but they definitely had a certain amount of territory and authority that was often in conflict with the Christian rulers of Ethiopia. There is a famous Queen Judith, is sometimes identified as a Jewish queen, and historians have identified the high point of their self-rule in the 16th century, followed by a marked decline as they slowly begin to lose much of their landed status. Their occupational profile changes from farming and going into crafts, pottery, and other types of semi-urban types of professions. Still very strongly represented in the martial arts, but gradually losing their connection to ancestral land, which would have very negative consequences when we get to the 18th and 19th century. Now, let us speak a little bit about what do we call these people. I've kind of danced around it, and the term Ethiopian Jewry is sort of vague. It is important to note that they would call themselves the Beta Israel, the house of Israel. And this was designed to contrast them from the Christians who were called the house of Christianity. They would not call themselves, ironically, the term for Jew is Ayhud. Pardon my hard pronunciation, which is really rusty. But apparently the term Ayhud was used by all people at the time to indicate people who were rebels, people who were, opponents, people who were, against the status quo. And so the Beta Israel, calling themselves Israelites, were recognizing their, Israelite origin, but knowing that the Ethiopian Christians also claimed an Israelite origin, they used a more specific term, Beta Israel, or Beta Israel, which designated they were not following the same faith as the Christians. They were following the Jewish faith, although they wouldn't call it that either. Now, the term falasha, which came into wide use through the 19th and 20th century, that's actually a derogatory term. It means roughly outcast or landless person, wanderer, and this was used to describe the Beta Israel during the period of their lowest ebb in terms of their economic and political power. They were gradually, over the course of the 17th and 18th and 19th century, pushed out of ancestral land holding, as I mentioned earlier, and so the negative term thrown at them was falasha, meaning they were landless, they were wanderers, and so on. The term of respect would be Beta Israel. Now, let us look specifically at the content of their faith, which is called the Haymanot, which means literally faith. It would have been used to describe different types of faith in Ethiopia, but in Israel it's used specifically to refer to classical Ethiopian Judaism. Now, perhaps we can, by looking at their Judaism, understand a little bit more about their origins. Here's a picture of a typical Ethiopian synagogue. Doesn't look so much like the synagogues that I pray in, but nevertheless, it'll work. When we look at the practices of the Ethiopian Jews, we see that they are entirely biblical. They show no evidence of rabbinic or Karaite. Rabbinic, of course, means the whole tradition that we've described in great detail in the past with the Midrash, Mishnah, and of course the Talmud. They do not have the Talmud, and they don't have any of the Talmudic teachings. Karaism, which we're going to, God willing, discuss a little bit in a couple of weeks, is essentially a sort of a break off from the rabbinic movement that tries to rely entirely on the biblical text without the Talmud, but nevertheless it's impossible to do so without specific interpretations anyways, and so we don't see them as Karaites either. Nevertheless, the hold to their belief with tremendous tenacity. But what does it look like? Well, fascinatingly, they retain a priestly sacrifice. The role of the Kohen is extremely important
Hey, what's
in
going on,
their
Percy?
daily life. Really, Sabbath service, observing it with the rabbinic overlays, just their understanding of what Sabbath service requires. They also have strict dietary laws. They practice a form of menstrual separation, which is similar to the laws of Nida. Interestingly, their calendar preserves the fast of Esther, which would have been associated with events that are situated in the 6th century before the Common Era. But they don't have Hanukkah, which is something that, of course, began in the 2nd century before the Common Era, which might be a nice placement for perhaps the ancient origins of the Ethiopian people, but it's also possible that they may have absorbed this either through the influence of Krimiarim or others, and they absorbed the calendar imperfectly, so it's not an absolute certainty. But there are several things in the Ethiopian Jewish faith which are definitely not common to other Jews. They have, for example, monasticism, a very strong emphasis on the leadership of monks. And they have incredibly heavy reliance on the text created within Ethiopian Christianity. Here's a look, for example, at the text they call the Orit, which is related to the word perhaps Oraita, Torah, the Aramaic word Oraita. You can see it's written in Ge'ez, which is the ancient scriptural language of Ethiopian Christianity and also of the Ethiopian Jews. And it appears that they simply took the Ge'ez translation of text, probably taken from the Greek, and used those as their central religious text. So there are some things that are going on in the development of Ethiopian Judaism which are not similar to what's going on in the rest of rabbinic Judaism. This would pose significant consequences for 20th century debate over the fundamental Jewishness of the Ethiopian people. We'll speak about that in a much later lecture. But I would note at this point that great scholars like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the chief rabbi of Israel and the most well-known 20th century rabbis, agreed with Ridvaz said that they are Jewish origin, and that really paved their way towards acceptance in Israel. Let us move now to the 19th century. And one of the things that I can also say about the Ethiopian Jews, that I've learned in my own research for this lecture, they have an incredible yearning for Zion that is demonstrated throughout the centuries. In 1855, however, there was an unfortunate event which began when an Ethiopian Jew, with the blessing of his elders in Ethiopia, brought his 13-year-old son Moshe to study in Jerusalem to try to learn what is it that we are missing, what is all this rabbinic stuff, what is the Talmud, and so on. And his pious intent was to learn more about how they should be behaving according to rabbinic tradition. Moshe stayed behind. He was left with a group of rabbis to study, and then he disappeared shortly thereafter, only to turn up again under the influence of an Anglican missionary named Samuel Gobat. And this is one of the rather unfortunate aspects of the Ethiopian experience, that once their presence became known to the outside world, the Christian world in particular, there was a dedicated effort to convert this tiny pocket of Ethiopian Jewry to Christianity, and was the subject of a significant effort by Protestant Christians in particular, as we shall see. However, the disappearance of Moshe ben Daniel was an unfortunate event because one of the first people to really raise questions about the Jewish status of the Ethiopian Jews was one of these rabbis, Rabbi Joseph Schwartz, who was assigned to study with Moshe initially. But let us return to the difficult aspect of this story, which relates to their targeting by Protestant missionaries. Perhaps the most significant of which is Henry Aaron Stern, a Jew who converted to Protestant Christianity and made it his career essentially to reach to the so-called Falasha, as you see here, an illustration from many books of the time. Much of the actual preaching was not done by Stern directly. He actually spent remarkably little time in Ethiopia, and the time he spent there was not well served because at one point he was arrested by the emperor, but many of his acolytes were the local Ethiopians who adopted Christianity and went on to proselytize on his behalf. Now, in 1862, a crisis occurred when a young man named Kindi Fanta converted to Christianity through this mission, and he was excommunicated by the village elder. Fanta then turned around and cursed them in the name of the emperor. And this curse apparently had tremendous impact on the population as a whole. The curse had phraseology to the effect of, may the emperor die if you do not stop offering ritual sacrifice. Now, the Beit Israel took this very seriously. I think this is part of the cultural milieu of Ethiopia, with which I am not that familiar. They took this very seriously, saying, oh my gosh, this curse must have some impact. And how are we supposed to behave according to our religion if that will place a death sentence on the emperor? So the Beit Israel went to court over this. Again, it's 1862. It's still the modern era, and several courts, they went through the motions. They actually nullified the curse, but people were still concerned about this. And ultimately, this came to an appeal before Tewodros, the emperor himself, who actually issued a new decree to limit sacrificial practice, which was a direct infringement on the religious life of Ethiopia. Now, in that same year, there is some debate about exactly the sequence of events, but in that same year, a large number of Ethiopian Jews, this number is not known, decided that they had no future in Ethiopia, and they attempted to march to Israel on foot, about 2,500 miles or 4,000 kilometers. The effort, although certainly the religious sincerity that motivated, ended in disaster. Numbers of Ethiopian Jews who hoped to make this great migration on foot were afflicted by hunger and disease, and ultimately the march ceased at Tigray in northern Ethiopia, and many survivors stayed there, and others tried to make it back to Lake Time. So this is kind of like a low point in many ways for the history of Ethiopian Jewry, but there will be a glorious 20th century development that we'll have to discuss next time we come back to Ethiopian Jewry. In the meantime, I hope you found this useful, and I have to say I find it absolutely inspirational, and I look forward to speaking next about the Jews of Khazaria, strangely a related topic. Thank you. I've recorded about 5 on now, and one of the surprising that in the top 10 popularity, my handful on being very popular. Unfortunately, as on the chapter projects with Nazi ended as a very, very tiny portion. Development goal for largely European and Middle Eastern. So let's take some time resolution, which is a burning question for many people. First of all, what is the Khazar hypothesis? Although it is shrouded in mystery, most historians coalesce around the idea that a population in the region of the Caspian Sea, not too far from the northern Black Sea, encompassing part of southeastern Europe, converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th century. They had come into existence in the 5th century as a proto-empire and then began expanding until they were finally defeated by the people of Kiev and Rus. That would be in today's Kyiv, Ukraine, in the 10th century. And then they came. Here's a map that shows up where Khazar Empire really boundaries generally. At the same time, when we have Ashkenaz, which is located primarily Lion land, and begins Jewish settlement there from somewhere around the 10th century onward. The name Ashkenaz is biblical origin, but it's applied in the medieval period. Now, from what we know from lots of other sources, there is a significant eastward expansion, migration of Ashkenaz. That I'm looking forward to discussing later videos. But there's a lot of spread of Ashkenazi, and there it constitutes the largest demographic chunk of European Ashkenazi. Here in yellow is basically where Ashkenazi race big migration the Americas, late 19th, 20th century, migration that my own ancestors. And that's Ashkenazi derives from Germany, so of those that term later migrated in Europe, America, Israel, and so on. That's other people such as started primarily Nigerian. Now here's the Khazarian hypothesis. There is something that was overlapped the Khazar Empire, some kind of connection, possibly a conversion to Judaism, perhaps and the population of Jews that by the time you get to the 20th century, the vast bulk of Ashkenaz. Khazar hypothesis Ashkenazim comes from Europe, not German Ashkenazim. They are actually descendants from the Khazars, and that's it. Now, why should we care about this? We'll talk about it in the next video. But that's the essence of the Khazar hypothesis. That the Jews who originate from Eastern Europe are primarily descended from the Turkic tribe living in Central Asia. Perhaps one of the most significant thinkers and writers on this period is Professor Shaul Stamfer of Hebrew University. Great scholars written quite a bit on Eastern European history, and he's published quite a bit on Khazarian. He has a very jaundiced view of the entire conversion process as a whole, the entire conversion story, which I'll speak about in the next video. But he says there are a few really clear reasons why we can say that Ashkenazi Jews are not descendants of others. First of all, there is no DNA evidence to support this. Go back to my earlier videos, as I've been doing over the last 10 years, there's been growing data in my own presentation because of new data. DNA evidence is one of the most exciting tools that historians have in their toolbox. And when it comes to the question of biological descent as opposed to halachic identity, which is a different thing, although they overlap in the Venn diagram, it's really clear that there's no DNA evidence or a very tiny element of DNA evidence to support the idea of Khazar origin Ashkenazi. Now, one exception to that rule is Professor Iran El-Haik, interesting things on this, but he remains controversial, and most scholars are not accepting research that he's presented specifically on Khazaria. Now, without being a scientist to be able to get into real nuts and bolts of this, what I've read about this is that he prepared in 2013, I think it was first published, an analysis of about 1,300 Y chromosomes, 1,300 people, looking at their Y chromosomes, tried to see what the similarities were between Jews and about 75 odd other nationalities. Fortunately, the sample was really small. Of the 8 parameters that we're looking at right now, tiny number about vast majority. Secondly, more significantly, the number of Khazar individual studies is zero. There are no today. In fact, at Khazar, 1,000 years, there has been no one walking around Khazar defense. In other words, you can't compare Khazar. Khazar actually, Khazar great. What he did was, yes, educate, yes, origin on area, but 1,000 years of possibility, hard to say that that's all at all. It's considered widely to be reliable, and scholars, historians are not accepting limited evidence just that. Secondly, we can pile on. Secondly, there's evidence of Khazar. One of the expected is that you pick up Khazar terminology in their Yiddish, by the way, is the overwhelmingly dominant native language of the Jews themselves, Ashkenazi, originally from Eastern Europe. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a census in the Russian Empire, and I think it was 98% of Ukrainian Jews, 97% of Jews throughout the empire, if I remember correctly, claimed Yiddish as their mother tongue. And there is no discernible evidence of Turkic in Yiddish. There are some interesting words here and there that are kind of uncertain derivation. The professor named Weinreich, who is one of the most important theorists of early Yiddish, argued that the word daven, which means pray, might come from a Turkic origin, but it's kind of up in the air. Absolutely, Yiddish is basically German, overwhelmingly German. Argument to the contrary, that its grammar is essentially Slavic, is nonsensical to anyone who studied all three language groups. If you study German, if you study Slavic languages, and you study Yiddish, you know that Yiddish is overwhelmingly German, written in Hebrew characters, with significant borrowing of Hebrew, Aramaic, both Jewish languages, and a certain amount of French, and all the various words that come along as the Jews are traveling through their migration. The small elements of Slavic grammar that are visible, particularly in the Eastern dialects of Yiddish, which is not at all surprising given that we're talking about the Slavic area. They're not Turkic, they're Slavic, very different languages. And they're basically like aspect and other finer grammatical forms. So the bottom line is Yiddish is way, way more German than it is Turkic. The Turkic elements, the Khazar elements, are vanishingly small if they exist at all. Third, there's no cultural evidence. Where are the recipes? Where are folk customs? Where are superstitions, stories, legends, songs that one would expect to come from origins? We don't have them in Ashkenazi culture. We have lots of Russian things, lots of Ukrainian, especially lots of Ukrainian, Polish, and so on. After 1,000 years of living in the region, we have evidence of German, of Latin, of French types of cultural, accretions that follow the Jews they travel, but we don't have any Khazarian things. So, the burden of proof is clearly on those who want to push this theory. The overwhelming amount of evidence suggests that the model of Jewish migration from Ashkenaz is exactly what happened historically. So then that brings us to the next question: where did Ashkenazi Jews come from? And I get this question a lot, actually. So this is Doron Behar, who was a remarkable geneticist, really advanced the field quite a bit. He's done some great studies on DNA, and they must have, most of them just appeared in the last few years. One of the most fascinating things that he discovered is that 40% of all Ashkenazi Jews are descended from precisely 4 women, apparently of European origin, and there's some indication that they lived about 1,000 years ago, or perhaps a little bit earlier. No indication they lived looked like they knew each other, but there are 4 specific women that seem to have had a tremendous impact on Ashkenazi Jews. Furthermore, statistically speaking, there are significant similarities between non-Ashkenazi Jews, like Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and so on, with Ashkenazi Jews. In other words, it still seems to be one big family, despite the superficial differences in skin tone and hair texture and so on. But Jews seem to be more or less one family, and there are significant distinctions between, especially Europe, and the peoples among whom they live. In other words, it all basically fits with the common sense idea of from Western Europe. The kind of element that Dr. Bihar was able to map out something called genetic drift, which helps to account for some of the superficial presentation of Ashkenazi people. As a layperson, my understanding of genetic drift is basically when you have, and by the way, I'll show you a Y chromosome in a second that says a lot more about males than females. This happens when, as is very common and well documented, non-Jewish women adopt Judaism and marry into Jewish people. This may be a much more pronounced conversion, women converting to Judaism than men converting to Judaism. This helps account for the physical distinction between, let's say, Mediterranean Jews and European. You also have a phenomenon, which is with the historical record, of a genetic bottleneck, where you have a population of people that, for a variety of reasons, which could be social, economic, political, they have to do with persecution, massacres, wars, things like that, but a larger group of people are suddenly shrunk over a period of time to be a much smaller population. There's a fairly large number of genetic disorders that unfortunately afflict Ashkenazi Jews, like breast cancer and Tay-Sachs, which may owe a lot to the fact that there was this bottleneck, perhaps around the turn of the millennium, that meant that the population of Jews living in northern Europe that would later move to the east represent the basis of a much larger population. The bottom line of all of this is that it's pretty much what we always were thinking, although Italy may be more important than most historians have thought. Have a look at this map here, which is also part of Dr. Bihar's research, and this is looking specifically at Levites on the Y chromosome. Now, Levites, like Kohanim, are members of the priesthood family, and they are, and it's only the males. It's passed down father to son. Others do not pass down the Levite connection. So, looking at the Y chromosome of Ashkenazi Jews, you'll be able to determine that it appears that they do have origins consistent with Middle Eastern distant origin, and then a strong migration through the Italian peninsula to the Ashkenazic heartland in Germany. That would be numbers 1 through 2 in the map. And then number 3 is, as we expected, a large migration towards the east, where most Ashkenazi Levites find their origins going back to that original vector. And then, as you see, the kind of the faded line there of the extension towards the west, along with the arrow labeled number 4, there is a reference back as most Ashkenazi Levites begin to move to the west, and in fact begin to form families with Sephardic women and non-Ashkenazi Jews generally in in the Iberian Peninsula is probably at the point number 2 on this map when those four mothers appeared, probably somewhere around the year 1000, and then are responsible for the huge expansion of Ashkenazi Jewry, and as a result, a tremendous popularity of Asian food now in America and so on. Now, if you look at these green lines here, this is the traditional view of the migration of Jews historically, which there's a lot to say for this, and it does not contradict the historical model that we have well documented moving their way across the coast of North Africa. But that particular route would not necessarily explain the origins of most Ashkenazi Levites. In other words, while Jews may have been moving along that route number 5, they do not account for the large number of Levites in Ashkenazi community, and so it's not demonstrated by the research that he worked on. Nevertheless, we do have Jews moving along the course of North Africa, not necessarily Levites that would end up combined in Ashkenazi. It's complicated in so many ways, but you get the idea, right? Okay, so that's our short answer. Ashkenazi Jews are not descended from the Khazars. They are descended from the Middle East and possibly an Italian vector. And there are 4 women, ironically, the Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah of Ashkenazi Jews that account for almost half of all Ashkenazi Jews today. In the next video, let us actually go to Khazaria and try to figure out what did happen. What can we say about the intelligence? Thank you very much for watching. Now that we have discussed the persistent question of the origin of Ashkenazi Jewry, let's go straight to Khazaria and try to understand what exactly do we know about the story of the conversion of the Khazars in that region, possibly in the 80s. The story of Khazaria is especially fascinating to think about the way it has been received by Jewish history. This is what the German historians call the Rezeptionsgeschichte, or the history of the reception, how an idea is formed, developed, and spread around. Perhaps the most important element of the Rezeptionsgeschichte of the Khazar conversion is this book, Kuzari, written by Rabbi Yehuda Levi, very, very important Spanish Jewish thinker in the 12th century. The story described in the Kuzari is essentially the story of the Khazar conversion as the great poet and philosopher developed in that book. The story goes like this. Basically, there is this King Ulan, who somewhere around the year 740 is a spiritual individual. And looking at the devotion of Islam, both Christian and Islam are making geographic headway in Asia and approaching its borders. And a couple of what remaining pagan, so joining one of the other faiths and so on. And so he has debate where he brings together a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. I know it sounds like book, but it's not. And he has them have a trilateral debate over which religion is superior. Again, you might expect the fact that this Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writing it, King Ulan decides to accept Judaism and all of his court and the Khazarian people ultimately follow. That's essentially the story. Now, notice that there's 500 years difference between the setting of this story and the authorship of the story. That's half a millennium. That's a lot of time. And we have to understand that the Khazari was chosen as a subject for Rabbi Levi because of circumstances in the Iberian Peninsula in today, specifically the trilateral relationship between Muslim and Christian, which is very unique to Spain and Portugal. Rabbi Levi essentially used the story of the Khazars as a literary foil to have a larger philosophical discussion about the relative merits of Christianity and Islam. And then, of course, by doing so, demonstrating that's that's the essential idea of the Kuzari and the actual historical element of the version of the Khazars is not necessarily important for what the wanted to achieve in his literary work. So let us set aside the Kuzari as a historical source. It's definitely not intended to serve as a historical source, to serve as literary source. Try to go what you know. So let's move back a couple hundred years to the correspondence of Hastai ibn Shaddad. Again, we're still about 300 years from the actual events described, but this is a fascinating, very important source, which was exceptionally important for Levi's work as well. Hastai ibn Shaddad, who I hope we will discuss in lectures when we look at Spain in the 9th century, very important diplomat who communicated with Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean. And he was fascinated with the story of the Khazar conversion, which was known to him. And so he sent out some emissaries to try and reach Khazaria and find out, what's going on there? Are you guys actually Jewish? Is this actually a Jewish kingdom? Now, for reasons which will take us beyond the scope of our discussion, his emissaries did not succeed in reaching Khazaria or speaking with any actual Khazarian, but they did receive correspondence from someone who purported to have brought letters from a king of Khazaria. These letters are absolutely fascinating. They relate the story of the conversion of Bulan. They talk about the nature of Khazarian Judaism and all kinds of fascinating things. But it's widely believed that these letters were forgeries. In other words, the people who provided the letters to the messengers of Hastai ibn Shaddad were essentially engaged in some kind of con. And they have no bearing on the actuality of Khazaria, and they don't have historical value for that purpose. So they're fascinating and they're really engaging, but are they real? Are they authentic? Are they actually letters from Joseph? Probably not. We do know, however, as we get closer and closer to the original dates, that there were medieval Jewish travelers who either had direct contact with Khazaria or direct contact with Khazarians in different places and report, however briefly, on their Jewish status, sometimes with a degree of surprise, sometimes with a degree of skepticism, but nevertheless, there's like more and more little tiny bits of evidence piling up in a lot of places, as we shall see many skeptics saying that the plural anecdote is not data, but it's hard to toss away little bits of information. For example, here's a fascinating document found in the Cairo Geniza. We will have opportunity to speak about what that is in a few lectures now, but basically it's a medieval trove of documents which were literally thrown away, but were amazingly preserved until they were unearthed in the late 19th century. And in this trove of documents is the so-called letter, which is basically a letter that is familiar to anyone who lives in the Jewish community today. When tzedakah collectors, when charity collectors come by Jewish homes, they typically present a document which is called a petek, and it's essentially a statement of the bona fides of the bearer of the document, saying that this person represents a legitimate cause, he's fallen on hard times, supporting orphans and widows or a charitable cause, one or the other. And it's expected that when someone presents you with this petek, which may be issued by the local community in which the donor lives, or it may come from the originating community, like from Jerusalem or wherever, then you give them charity and they build up their cause. So this is exactly one of those documents. The only real difference between this document and the ones we use today is that the ones we use today are laminated. Typically, this is not laminated, but it comes from Kiev, which indicates that that was part of the range of Khazaria. In fact, the great Harvard historian Omelian Prinzak argued that Kiev may have been founded by Khazarian Jews, believe it or not. At any rate, the letter, which comes from Kiev, specifically describes how the person is known, how at times the person is worthy, and usually specifically support his cause. And then amazingly at the bottom, you can see it highlighted here in the image, there is a signature in what appear to be Turkic runes that say, I have read it, or we have read it. Fascinating. That indicates that there was evidently people who, because normally this would be the signature of someone who was important in the Jewish community, like a rabbi or the Parnas of the community, or the president of the community, and he obviously is completely illiterate in Hebrew and needs to write in Turkic runes, which would be very unusual unless there was a distinct Khazaric community in Kiev at the time. We have multiple references from Arab historians to a Jewish presence in Khazaria as well. And perhaps one of my favorite examples is in one of the most important early historical documents that describe the origins of the Kiev population, which later would grow into modern-day Ukraine. It's also shared with the Russian Empire and the Polish Empire and so on. It's called Popes Romaniae, or Chronicle of Bygone Years, which is essentially a church record of the history of the region. Fascinating description of a key element in the Christianization of the region, specifically the conversion of King Volodymyr, or Vladimir, to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And amazingly, it's exactly like the story in the Khuzari. There is a representative of Islam. There are two representatives of Christianity, both Western and Eastern Christianity, and there is a representative of Jews, and that representative is specifically a Khazarian Jew. And it's absolutely fascinating that not only do they replicate the story that is essentially told in the letters of Hasdai Ibn with Joseph, they actually report the same kind of scenario. Of course, it ends up that King Volodymyr decides to become Christian rather than Jewish. Could you imagine how history would have changed had he chosen Jewish? He very nearly did, by the way. But this is, one of those data points that is really hard to ignore, speaking to the idea of a Jewish community in Khazaria at the time. So-called Billings Board. A number of them that come from Khazaria around the time, like the 9th century. This one writes in Arabic, sort of a paraphrase on the famous statement of Islamic faith. There is no God but Allah, and Moses is his prophet. That's an unusual kind of statement there. And then there are some tempting examples of Jewish symbols on Khazar architecture, which is limited. There are not a lot of finds, but this menorah symbol from Khazar archaeological dig is especially interesting. All of these things come together to suggest that something really important happened in this region that involved Judaism. But what exactly happened? Let's have a look at that. Okay. If you ask Professor Shaul Samson, who was mentioned in the last lecture when we were talking about DNA, Dr. Samson is one of the biggest skeptics of the whole story. He says it is, quote, a splendid story. Right? You can finish the rest of that sentence. In other words, there's not much to it. So we still have all these little bits of data. We have a letter, there's Jewish for corn, and things like that. But there's all that. So trying to put it together, one of the biggest questions we have is, if they did convert to Judaism, I tend to believe something happened there. Including other ideas like anti-gravity, antimatter. There does not seem to be a really good
mind of living technology, life extension technology, basically futurism. And I want to inject into the discussion of the world some of these futuristic advancements and really overall advance humanity as best I can.
It's also possible that maybe it has to do with the geopolitics of the era, because there's did fight wars with the rapid expansion of Christianity, which would overtake
There could be another person. I'm not exactly sure. I do know that I have
maybe they chose to adopt Judaism as some kind of potentially neutral position. Perhaps they hope to say that, hey,
they tolerated spam, and they also create a clip, which really makes mine unique. I have so many clips. I think like 50% of every clip that comes out on tape has my Discord in it, which is really exciting. And then additionally,
but we also have to
what
remember
I've done
that
is basically create
remarkable
a persona where everybody knows who I am on tape. And while I may currently be banned, perhaps in the future that ban may go away.
Not so far away.
Well, yeah, and that was voluntarily because I decided, you know what, I'm live on YouTube. I'm live on 33 different devices. Let me give you a quick room tour. Oh, yeah, let me give you a tour. So right over here, I'm live in Telegram. I'm live in cryptocurrency. It's called Harry Potter Polygon 10 Edo. I know it's a lot of words, but essentially this is the biggest cryptocurrency global history. It's backed by data. I've been live streaming into Telegram for more than a year. When I started with the coin, it was worth less than a penny. Like 2 weeks ago, it was worth like 7 cents. Last week, it's at 31 cents. It has like a $300 million market cap, so it's a very serious coin. Ross has said that he's going to perhaps buy into it allegedly. He should. Anybody else should as well, because it's going to be really big. Reason why I've been live streaming in Telegram 24/7 takes place for more than a year. Over here, I'm in some Discord. You're going to see I'm in a whole bunch of Discords. All these devices are in Discord. Oh yeah, it's a big deal, my friend. You're live on Discord here, and live on YouTube here. The different platforms on which I am are YouTube, Discord, Telegram. Currently, I'm live on all those. Twitch. I'm live on Rumble. I'm live on Billy, which is huge in China. I'm live on Africa TV. I'm live on YouNow. I'm live on quite a few different ones. It's really pretty phenomenal. And I do my best to multi-shoot to be uncancelable. YouTube doesn't like what I say. That's fine. I'm still archived on all over the internet. And some of my streams are even labeled with my name. So they're essentially archived for the world. And I've done what I can to essentially create a time capsule for humanity. This goes back to the pandemic. We see the death of a queen, the birth of AI, the coronation of a king, and everything in between. You've been able to watch my life in 360 degrees, 24/7 for more than 3 years. And when the world finds out about this, it's going to be very, very exciting. I think so. Wait, so if you're live all the time,
last time. But they like pop up now and then.
Great question.
So one
of the things that we do in our community is we do our best not to reference, so to speak. If I do have to do anything, generally I'll just give them no covers, and no one knows that I'm doing the covers. But yeah, I do my best to essentially retain as best as possible. But the more I retain, the higher the coin goes. Like I said, $100 million market cap. That's really here. Let me give you so over here behind me, we're watching History of Judaism lectures.
As I mentioned in the beginning of the last video, I get a lot of questions and a lot of attention about the concept. Sometimes I have to cut off
all the other things that I said. Really feeling Africa TV, which you would think would be big in Africa, but it's not big in South Korea. I've seen Judaism on except over here we have my kick class. So
the implications are actually quite significant.
You're going to see front center the kick class. Okay, so here is a random email, and it's typing. You're going to see it's got a pink cursor.
He's written quite a few controversial books. It's called The Invention of the Jewish People. He essentially argues that
Ashkenazi Jews, as we discussed in the last video, Ashkenazi Jews are not really Jewish. That this entire sub-ethnic group of the Jewish people, which had such a profound impact on modern politics in particular, since the 19th century in particular, they're not actually descended from these biblical Jews ancient Israel. Now this has a lot of appeal to people who modern patriarchate, maybe for religious reasons, that they want to feel that modern Ashkenazi Jews don't have a real share in the matrimonial covenant. Not that it really makes a difference in terms of Jewish law, and although I'm not a theologian, I don't think it's sure what kind of difference it makes theologically. The argument of some people, frankly, Semites, that modern Jews are not real Jews, is a way of delegitimizing their ethnic identity. Saying that we don't have to accord them respect that their ancient patrimony might otherwise be afforded for them. We don't have to regard them as being, millennial followers of an ancient tradition, and perhaps therefore, we don't have to even apply the doctrine of witness to them. We can consider them usurpers, racial interlopers who have somehow taken away the custom. Either sometimes among black supremacists who argue that the real Jews are actually black, and those white Jews who claim to be Jews can't be because we are. As we discussed when we looked at the Jews of Africa, there are Jews who are black as well, and it's not a factor in the theological or the halachic application of Jews. So a lot of anti-Semites really like the Pythagorean hypothesis, and for people like Professor Young, they also see kind of like a liberal approach to this as well, where the right wing may see it in terms of traditional anti-Semitism. The left wing, as Professor Young, he wishes to associate himself specifically with the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. Ashkenazi Jews, the argument goes, are not really Jewish, and Israel is to be a homeland for Jews. That, therefore, the argument goes, invalidates the Ashkenazi claim to the land of Israel as their homeland. And that's a pretty strong thing to say politically, and that's why, ironically, I find the Hadayan hypothesis being advanced by those who have the Jews both on the right and on the left. That's why this is but in terms of the overall scope, just a tiny little footnote, a fascinating one, a splendid story to Dr. Johnson's message, but we're going to move on from this. We're going to look at a much more significant topic. We're going to look at the growth of Jews, particularly look at the Thank you very much.
Thing that I send out basically where we talk about life extension technology, mind uploading technology, all of that, and it's all automated. Essentially, what it will do is it will recognize.
Let us now return to the Middle East, to the heartland of Babylonia, the Mesopotamian region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, for the immediate Talmudic period, which is associated with the leaders of the academies known as the Gaonians. This term Gaon is derived from the Hebrew Gava, which means pride. It can also mean arrogance, depending on a person of Gava would consider a very arrogant person. In this context, it means like the pride and joy of the community. Here's a quick map from the Barnabi Atlas that shows influence of the Gaonim of Baghdad. You can see on the right there, there's a kind of blue circle with Baghdad right at the center. And that's where the centers of Talmudic learning shifted during the period after the Islamic invasion and conquest of the region. They were located further south, Surah, and so on, and Baghdad eventually became the major administrative center of the entire Islamic Empire and also of the Ionic Empire, if you will, which mirrors much of it. What I really like about this particular map is has the sort of like arrows that are reaching out in three directions from Baghdad, which gives you a sense of their relative cultural and intellectual influence, to a certain political influence as well. But they also have that brown circle with Jerusalem at the center there, that represents the influence of the traditional center of Talmudic learning. There were, of course, two Talmuds written, one Babylon, and as obviously the Babylonian Talmud. The other one, not quite as obvious, but primarily in Tiberias, as the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, and the relative strength of the expositors of those two Talmuds, who definitely were linked to each other, had a lot of communication with each other, began to change as we got past the Islamic conquest of the region. And Jerusalem declines in authority, and Babylon, Baghdad in particular, ascends in authority. Now,
understand that all of this stuff is happening largely as a consequence of the Islamic expansion across the coast of North Africa into Spain and further east all the way up to Pakistan and Bangladesh. There are a lot of political and economic reasons why the owning had such an assist in reaching these far-flung Jewish diasporas. First of all, we should understand that with the Muslim conquest, the Jews of Babylonia were no longer separated from the various diasporic communities by a political boundary. So they were really one cultural orbit, one linguistic orbit, one economic orbit, and it was much more convenient and safe for them to travel back and forth. We no longer had the geopolitical conflict between, let's say, the Roman, the Byzantine Empire, and the Persian Empire. Putting it all under the Muslims really had a tremendous impact on the ability of Jews to communicate with each other, to engage in interregional trade and things like that. Another very important thing that happens is a symbiosis that develops between the communities in the diaspora, as far away as Spain, let's say, and the center in Baghdad. On the one hand, much smaller communities outside of the traditional center are able to send requests for information, for clarification of Jewish law, requests are called introductions to Elah, and the leaders of the academy, they're able to send back responses, called the legal issue books. So the whole major genre of rabbinic literature called She'elot Teshuvot, answers or questions, and sometimes in English they singular would be responsive. And so there's a symbiosis in the sense of these small communities are able to ask Baghdad for questions, and with their requests they send funds to support the academy's activity, and at the same time, besides providing intellectual and spiritual guidance for these, Baghdad can also confer official confirmation of the municipal leadership of these Christian buildings, much more significant in terms of municipal leadership of the community. We'll speak a little later about how the community is structured. But so there was a symbiosis between the diaspora and Baghdad, periphery and the center, that only began to really fray as Spain in particular got much more significant towards the end of the period we're discussing. Also note, of course, that there is a rivalry between the Jerusalem center and the Baghdad. Ultimately, Baghdad eclipsed Jerusalem. Let's also think for a second about the impact of language, because by incorporating this entire territory under Islamic rule, Arabic as a language really begins to act as a much more effective English contact for the entire region. And this has significant impact not only for political and economic reasons that I described earlier, but also in terms of the way Jews thought about their own language. The Arabs regarded Arabic as a holy language, a language that had phenomenal aesthetic appeal, both in terms of structure, its grammar, vocabulary, and its calligraphy. And the Jews had a similar kind of cognate feeling about. So this idea of course, Hebrew and Arabic are very closely related languages. Cultural give and take there in terms of the absorption of Arabic as important language, used and of course writing in Arabic with Hebrew letters at the time. This was called Judeo-Arabic, and it was a very widely used language among Jews. Important element that's going on at this time is the very significant shift towards urbanization. Up until this point, Jews have largely been, like most peoples of the Middle East, agrarian people. The majority of their economy was associated with agriculture, and there were always elites who were active in culture and in commerce and so on in these small cities at the time. During the period of Asian conquest, that really began to shift towards more urban, towards craft, tools, things like that were prominent from the 7th. One of the reasons for this is the way in which most attack the Jewish population in particular and in general attack. Jews were, of course, required to pay full tax on the individual and tax from Jews. We spoke about that years ago. And by the way, another aspect of the consolidation of the region was that if you had the receipts that you would pay much more movement across the region, you go to someplace where people would know you and you could produce your receipts necessary without less difficulty with the local authorities. But they had another tax called halal, was collective land tax based on individual units of farmland. And the challenge of the halal was that it was applied based on territory rather than population. So if you had 100 people living in a particular area and farming a particular section of real estate, and let's say 20 people left that area, that meant that 80 people had to carry the burden that was once carried by 100 people. And if another 20 people left, then 60 people had to manage that same tax burden. So it was kind of like an acceleration effect where the villages began emptying out populations, especially the Jews, who saw the cities as a much more amenable of earning their living and a lighter tax burden. It's also lots of other benefits for Jews. You know, Jews have to be very gregarious people. They need to walk to synagogue, they need to be walked just on ritual baths, restaurants, all kinds of things like this. So it's their cultural evolution. This is Professor Rothschild, a very important scholar of the Geneva. We'll speak about it really in another lecture. The confluence of economic expansion's influence and the discovery of a new method of communication that is specifically through. Now, historically, when new technologies have been developed, Jews tend to be early adopters, especially when it's associated with information technology. You know, the Arabs call the Jews the people of the book, but really we are the people of information. So any way that we can communicate more effectively is something that feels good. Take a look at the history of information technology up to this point, and it'll be clear what actually happened made a huge difference. Here, perhaps the oldest form of recorded information technology we have is the cuneiform tablet. It is basically a clay tablet that has these little wedge-shaped marks embedded into it and shaped. Great for durability. I mean, this is a piece of clay. It lasts a long, long time. It's hard to destroy it. Really handy for archaeologists, but heavy to carry around, awkward to store, difficult to read, all kinds of things that make this not such a great choice. And the next evolution in information technology is kind of parchment, which is very widely adopted by Jews, toward parchment, and this is essentially treated animal skins. much more convenient to record, store, and carry than cuneiform. And parchment has another kind of interesting feature that we don't recall that often in documentary method of communication. It can be reused in kind of a blunt way. Specifically, once you write on parchment, then if you want to use that text again, take some kind of like hard object, like let's say a type of ruler or stick, and you can rub it really hard. That doesn't erase the letters, but it sort of fades, it breaks down the ink that's held by the animal skin such that it becomes less prominent. And then you can just go and write on top of it. This is called a palimpsest, and you can see here, right? The original text is a Greek text. On top of it is a Hebrew text. Now, it's not very beautiful by contemporary standards, but it is rather useful that way. If you're familiar with the classic Pirkei Avot, where Elisha ben Abuda says, someone who learns in old age or learns as an adult, to what may this be compared? Writing on rubbed parchment. Meaning, if you learn as an adult, like when you're or something like that, then you have to like erase by rubbing all that stuff you out. You never really erase away. Once you learn as a child, as a it's stuck in your brain and very, very systemic manner, and you have to write on top of it, which is not ideal, but never can do it. On the other hand, Elizabeth is now the when you're a child, that is much better than writing a fresh file that's nice and fresh and high contrast. Oh, this is parchment. It's adopted parchment in a big way. The other big development in the ancient world was papyrus, which is a plant product, and the most famous place for producing papyrus is Egypt, where they use lots of reeds along the Nile River. And you can see from this Egyptian document, holds color well, it's very beautiful, and in fact, it can be made to a book form, unlike parchment, which works really well with scrolls. The papyrus can be cut up into like square slices and then bound on one side into what's called a codex or a book. This was actually very much by writers in the first century, and so it was adopted by the emerging Christian movement as a major form of information technology. Though, of course, the Christian movement is, of course, also Jewish, and so it adopted this technology. However, when the Christians used grew wider in the 3rd century and onward, many communities of the papyrus because it was so heavily associated with the Christian movement. It also has some technological weaknesses. A papyrus tends to fray at the edges because it is a fibrous product, and so it tends to be a little bit more fragile in terms of codex. The next big invention, which is where we are in our Babylonian period, is of course paper. Paper has been around for several hundred years. The Chinese had developed it significantly, but it was only in the period of the Islamic conquest in the East when the Babylonians began to see the great value of paper and they used it extensively. Paper is cheaper than papyrus. It can be it's much more durable than papyrus, and of course paper lasted for an extremely long time. And so in the period of the Geonim, the rapid expansion of the use of paper as a mode of communication among Jews across the entire diaspora in the Islamic world represented an opportunity for the Jews to accelerate their business. A lot more correspondence happening back and forth, both religious, spiritual, and also economic, personal. A lot more writings are being produced and are being copied out. Because, think about it. In order to produce a reasonable sized book, that might be 300 animals to create enough parchment. But with paper, cheaper to produce these things and much more efficient to ship them off to various places. So this is a period of a great expansion.
have a more unified view about how to interpret the Torah that we really are able to capitalize on if the communication methods made possible by paper. Now, at this moment, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a personal meditation and think about how it impacted my life, not as a historian, but as a regular person. I have to say that when I was preparing this lecture, I had one of those flashes of momentary inspiration where I sensed in my own biography the great arc of history. I felt like I was riding a big wave of a historical moment. Let me share this with you. So have a look at this picture here. This is actually a photograph I took a few years ago of one of my sons sitting on a dock of cropping just outside my hometown in northern Canada. And this is a place where I, as a child, used to hike out to and sit and think about, life, the universe, and everything. And as you can see, I've laid on the left, on the Abitibi River, is the paper mill that sustained this town. It was established at the beginning of the 20th century, and there was no one here at most part of northern Canada, but they took advantage of the old growth forests and the river network to create a paper mill that would serve the burgeoning interest of print readers. The town gathered around this paper mill, which included my grandfather, Olav Shalom, named Alex Abramson, who had immigrated from Lithuania to avoid fighting the Japanese in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, and thought he would make a living as a farmer. Unfortunately, the permafrost of the area made it an unusually bad choice for farming. And so after a few years of trying that, he said, well, that's what I'm going to become the Yiddish Ashmata dealer, which is a clothing store. And he established, you can see on the right, Alex Abramson and Sons, sometimes taking the smaller one right in the back there, which was the ancestral home of him and his children, and my father, who was down in the Alexander, and of course then my mother and I lived in the apartments off the Victoria. And so for a second here, I thought about how the Babylonians expanded the use of paper to popularize the Talmud, and paper just got more and more popular over the next thousands of years until my own lifetime, in which the paper mill declined precipitously because few people read actual newspapers anymore. And the demand for paper has dropped so much. And my father, Oliver Shalom, understood in a very pressing way that each of the air hotels was looking dim because there was this industry down. And so he ensured that I would be able to go to the big city, Toronto, where I would Talmud that was popularized by the Canadian on pages on paper, but now I work primarily in material which is entirely digital. Today. What we're doing in studying history right now is very far from paper. There's no way to actually capture this on paper. So we have really come to a brand new cycle in information technology transfer. I'm very excited to be at this cusp of a great new moment for the popularization of Talmud and Jewish history in general. Okay, before that little sort of tangent, let's go back to the topic. The Geonians, of course, are the leaders of the academies now based in Baghdad. And we actually know a fair bit about them because a really interesting letter that was written by the heads of one of these academies, Rabbi Rothschild. That one is not a surname, it's a title. And he was asked by North Africa, hey, can you explain to us, of course, in a much more formal language, how exactly did the Talmud come to be? And what we make of these kinds of conflicts and how we use it and so on. And he writes a kind of a pamphlet-length, book-length letter responding, explaining a lot about the evolution of the Talmud as a manuscript, and he goes beyond the period of the Talmud, which would be around the year 500, to describe the next 500 years the earlier period. At this point, we should really talk about the growing conflict between the Gaonim as the intellectual and spiritual leaders, not only of Baghdadi Jews, but really of worldview at this time, and the exilarchs who are recognized by the Muslim authorities as the word prior to this. Exilarch in Aramaic is Reish Sharika, and it's actually a prayer that's translated the position even today in synagogues or prayer in the Orthodox on Saturday morning for the health and welfare of the exilarch. The term, of course, exilarch means leader of the exile. But that's not to say that the Gaonim and the exilarchs always saw eye to eye with one another. Of course, the person who would reach the height of being the leader of the academy had to be very familiar with Jewish law and had to be, administrator and so on. Whereas the exilarch was a descendant of the house of David. That was a very important thing. And there was a lot of politics involved in maintaining that particular position. So what you see frequently in the Talmud is kind of like these occasional moments of friction. There were exilarchs who were much more pious, much more learned, but it seems that they were the exception to the rule. And perhaps one of the clearest examples of this, the awkwardness that this created, was regarding an exile named Bushkanah. He was alive at the time of the Muslim conquest, and when the Persian king was defeated, the Muslim conqueror took some of his daughters, that is the Persian king's daughters, the princesses. He took one of them for himself as a bride, and he gave the other one to the exilarch Bushkanah. He had a number of sons with her, who later went on to become exilarchs as well. Kind of an awkward moment because it doesn't sound like I first of all, she's not Jewish. Second of all, she's taken captive in war. Thirdly, it looks a little bit like a kind of shotgun marriage where these two Muslim rulers here, this and so the rabbis in the Gaonim difficulty dealing with this particular situation. Ultimately, they found sort of like a halachic way to accept it. Specifically, we argue that although we don't know the details, but it's hard to believe that someone as important as the exilarch would not actually have his life converted. It certainly must have converted to Judaism, and so that kind of like assuaged concerns. But there was always kind of like a lingering doubt. Rav Shmuel Gaon, for example, was very careful to point out that even though I am also descended from exilarchs, I'm not from my exilarch part of the family. It's kind of like an arm's length relationship to it. And so we frequently see conflict between the Gaonim and the exilarchs over of activity. In this context, we have to mention one of the most important of the Gaonim ever, very unusual and creative figure, Rav Saadia Gaon, who lived in the late 9th and early 10th century. He was a brilliant scholar. He wrote very effectively on Hebrew linguistics. He wrote commentary on the Torah. He engaged in very polemic Karaite. We'll discuss in just a moment. And he actually was not afraid of taking a fight over his interpretation of the Torah. One significant element was a conflict he had with the leaders of Jerusalem who disagreed on something as important as the calendar, specifically when would Yom Kippur fall in a particular year. And Rav Saadia Gaon strongly argued for a different date than that. Ultimately, he actually won that particular debate. And that really demonstrated the primacy of Babylonia over Jerusalem. He himself was not a Babylonian. He was from Egypt. And in fact, one of the big surprises was when the exilarch actually appointed him to the Academy of Shura. And later on, the exilarch had a conflict with Rav down, even though he originally hired the conference, they eventually able to back it up. But this is a intellectual academic head to the community, and at the same time a political head to the community that may be associated with wealthier powers. They frequently come into conflict with one another. But it is the donate that really has the longest impression of the leadership. I alluded a moment ago to one of the activities of Sunday down, and that is his conflict with Karaites. Karaites are a fascinating population that I hope we'll turn to later on in the series, but it is in the period when they really begin to see significant growth. Unlike the mainstream Jewish community, which are called the Rabbinites, who follow the interpretive tradition that includes the Talmud as a major source of knowledge in the Torah. The Karaites reject that interpretive tradition and argue that the original biblical text has to be observed much more strictly. There are many occasions in which the Talmud discusses the ambiguities in the original text of the Torah and argues that it should not be on a value. This is inevitable. There are so many passages in the Torah which admit of ambiguity. Sometimes there are passages in the Torah which appear to be contradictory to one another. And the only way to negotiate these kinds of difficulties is to have an interpretive tradition. So I figure in the 8th century, Anan ben David had proposed rejection of the Talmud as a whole. There's a lot more interesting story about why exactly this happened. We have really only polemical accounts to describe his disagreements with the community as a whole. It appears that he was, for example, his lines become an exodus, was passed over, and some have argued that this was part of the reason for his creation of an alternative interpretive tradition. Anyway, he didn't form what were called the Karaites, but later for his legacy as their primary impetus for their religious thought. The Karaite movement, however, expanded significantly throughout these centuries, despite the long-term conflict with the Rabbinites. And here you can see on this map many centers that they established themselves in, and of course they exist to this very day. And when you look at Karaite history, for hundreds of years, historians have been forced to kind of evaluate this movement from within the context of the highly polemical religious literature that exists on the topic. That is, Rabbinites, like Rabbi Rothschild, criticizing the Karaites, and Karaites criticizing one another. So it's very difficult to get a sense of how Karaism actually lived in real life. Wikimedia, however, offers us a brand new picture of what it must have been like. Wikimedia is basically this massive trove of documents which would have been thrown away except for that usual habit where Cairo had of everything written in Hebrew characters. Not just religious books, prayer books, horoscopes, things like that, but also bills of sale, marriage contracts, personal correspondence, children's doodles, all kinds of amazing things that are recorded in this massive trove, which only became available to scholars in the late 19th century, and in fact is still being deciphered even to this very day. At any rate, when you look at the medieval documents, which give us a really good picture of hundreds of years of civilization as it was lived in that civilization, we see that surprisingly, Rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews get along pretty well for the most part. We're not talking about the religious elites that have strong antipathy toward one another, but in most communities, you see that Rabbinite Jews and Karaite Jews live side by side without much difficulty. You have the examples of Jews who belong to both communities, Jews who marry communities, certainly have contracts with one another, do business with one another, celebrate their celebrations with another, and by and large, Jewish communities indicate that Rabbinite and Karaite Jews got along a lot better than they would if we were only looking at the
literature that the religious heads have left for us. So we'll probably have to come back to this again as we go a little further. But for the time being, I hope you enjoyed this very quick overview of some of the religious, social, economic, and even ecological aspects of the 7th to 11th century in Baghdad. Thank you very much for watching. So we just finished talking about the Gaonic period. One of the communities that was most by the Gaonic of Baghdad, Jews in North Africa. Let's take a look at the origin of that community and understand how they were used by the conquest and lectures one of the high points of the scholarship that emanated from North Africa. So when we speak about North Africa, there's actually a term that scholarly literature, Maghreb, which is really the West, and it's Arabic term that Morocco, the population is highest on the south, as you can see, the south you get the Sahara Desert, much less populated. But there are Jews who are living, for example, on the southern side of the range of Morocco. So talk about the origin of long-standing. Now, much of this is shrouded in legend. There is definitely, however, significant North Africa. First, Lenny, 900, but it's not necessarily Jewish. These are a maritime civilization that, of course, was involved in Israel as well, and they have settled places on the coast. Their language, and so that was kind of like a cultural meditation that was especially significant for migration. As far as the legends of settlement suggest that some of the early populations similar Jesus suggests that some of Abraham's children did not form, let's say, the Bush branch, that children by Pura, or by obviously they returned the different tried also possible traveling west. It would have been descendants of Abraham. August in the 4th century, we spoke about fathers of Bible. He refers to the local term of Nami, saying this actually comes from Canaan, Canaanite. Some of the earliest people were those that may have been expelled in conquest after Joshua. They thought that now Torah was one of the 17 nations that are expelled in conquest around Israel. In terms of Jewish settlement per se, Joshua himself proved 2 years of generations. This was when I was at University of California. Unlikely that Joshua actually moved to the west. The west was kind of like part of the course of war. But the fact that there were speakers not Aramaic suggests that it is not at all impossible to imagine migration from the not just science, how to learn it. That is after the destruction of folks. That's every year
At any rate, whatever you make of these various legendary possibilities, there's no question that we have strong populations there, first and second countries, lots of populations all around the world, after the war, the intense growth of United States, have the migration after the Buffalo Rebellion, you know, that no question. Interactions with archaeological discoveries such as that originally thought to be of get into it today, but not the least of which is identifying that big seed that exists within all of us that can guide our decisions in terms of finding our purpose. And so I usually end with gratitude. Very classic Jewish representation. Menorah, I want to start with mastery and the Muslim context essentially it really embedded this idea that we all have the discovery of purpose and explains how we go about it. I tell you that I also that's a big way for acceptable in English, how do you find your purpose? Are you sure what it is to making purpose and how life events perhaps each one. Thank you for that marvelous introduction. Well, being a human being is not easy. Nobody gives us like a direction. Our parents might be able to do that, college teachers, etc. mentors, but generally we're on our own. It's very, very typical process. You wake up in the morning and you don't really know what you can do. You choose 12 different paths. You're very confusing and very overwhelming. When you find that sense of purpose, when you find what I call your life's task, everything has direction, everything has a purpose, energy is concentrated. It's not like you're just going down a single narrow path. It's not like life is boring and it's just about discipline and solving problems. It's actually the most distractions, boring and irritating. You're able to cut it out. It's just a marvelous piece of internal radar that you can have. Well, I genuinely wish that everybody had kind of internal radar. And so it's not easy, and I understand that. There's no like instant formula because we're all about instant formula. It's difficult. And I want you to know that so it's not like, oh, in here for 20 minutes. No, I can't. There's a process. It's not a mystery. You can follow a very singular process. And the idea is, we're talking about childhood. The way I like to frame it is, when you were born, you are a phenomena, you are unique. Your DNA has never occurred in the history of the universe, going back billions of years. It never occurred in the future. Your life experience with your parents and everything that you experience in your early years going on is unique in yours. One of a kind. So that is your source of power. To waste that, which is the worst thing you can do. And what the power is finding that unique, what makes you you, and how you can find and go deep into it and use that to create a career path. Right? And so I tell people when you're a child, when you're 4 or 5, even younger, you have what raise a conscious mass called impulse voices. The little voices in your head that say, I love this, I hate that, I like this food, I don't like when mommy, I like when daddy comes from here. You're very into who you are and what you like and what you don't like. And these voices kind of direct you in certain ways, right? And when you're very young, they direct you towards intellectual, mental pursuits as well. And there's a book I recommend for everybody, Howard Gardner's 5 Frames of Mind. It's helped me immensely. The idea is, he talks about 5 intelligence. Our problem is we think of intelligence as mostly intellectual, but there are many forms of intelligence. There's the intelligence that has to do with words, it's an abstract intelligence that has to do with patterns and mathematics.
kinetic intelligence, social is alive.
Rabbi
The idea is your brain naturally
in
gears towards
previous
one of
lectures,
the
Talmud is a
geared
very
towards two
unusual
that
document in which
happens. But
there's a
generally
lot of
one of them
discussion
dominates, right? And
how
it's like
one should
brain
behave
in
as
your
a Jew.
brain. All you
Back
do is
and forth this
direction.
debate,
When it
looking
comes
at
to
the
the brain,
beauties of the text and
that's your
arguing
brain.
for position
So
sometimes,
you're young,
but
you go
not
back
all the
and
time,
think
coming to a
4 or
clear
5
and
years,
resolved
maybe a
conclusion.
picture of
But the
kind
Talmud
of
also includes a
direction
tremendous
or
amount of
flight.
material which
Maybe that was
seems quite
telling you to do
tangential
this.
and
I know for
goes
me,
off and talks about
words,
metaphysics or
when I was
biography
6 years old, I was
or
just the letters and
observation of
like
the
it was
universe,
slightly
all kinds of
schizophrenic.
things
I
that
was
have
built
a
back
feeling that
part I would
are
do
attached to
diagrams
very,
and
very
palindrome, right?
connected
So I
to
had a thing about
and
primal.
some
Some
people
people,
say
so
agree.
Albert
But
Einstein,
the Abbasi said,
readers
wait,
of Bobby,
really
come,
just by how
he was just
so you went
mesmerized
through
with
the entire time,
the idea that
you
there are
remove
invisible
all
forces
of that
out there that
other
cause
stuff.
moving this
I
these
personally
this big
I
idea that
find that much more
Steve
anyways.
Jobs, like 7 or 8, maybe
Removed all
younger,
that stuff
really,
and
his
inserted the
father
debate
has
in
by
the
a
Talmud
sword
back and forth,
technological
inserting
devices,
this commentary
and
as
he was just
necessary in the
hypnotized by the
narrative,
size of
somehow
the devices
clear
that last
and
to.
clear.
So he
And
wanted to
he
go in
made a
that
much more
direction. Tiger Woods saw his
pragmatic,
father hitting golf
this is
balls
how the
in the
Talmud
garage, and he was
provides
just like
the
screaming with
final
joy. He had to
legislation
do that,
that
right?
eventually
You know, I can give you a
will
million
block
different
the
examples.
entire
Of course,
tournament
these are
of
maybe
Jewish
more
law.
famous, obvious.
Usually
You
the
go there
text
and
that
find
is
them
at the
easier.
back of
But what
every
happens
Talmudic
to you,
text
and
in
please tell me
tradition
what's going on
today.
please,
Mentioned
what
before we
happens
leave
to
this
you
that
is you're 7,
another
now you're getting
author,
older,
about 500 years
and you
later,
start to hear that voice.
Habib,
You're hearing
you know
the
what?
voice of your
All
teacher
that other
who's
stuff
telling
is
you,
so good.
you're not good at this,
So
you need to get better at math.
whereas the
Now,
Alfasi,
you should
all
be
of the
into a
meta
sports
only the
industry.
halacha, even
Parents
the
are
Habib
starting
said,
to
no,
tell
I'm
you,
going to do the opposite. I'm
we're
going
going
to
to
take all of your
direction I want
Gadata
you to go.
in a second book, which
Start
is
hearing
published under
that
the
in your own
Talmud
voice. As you get
he
older, it gets
his
worse and worse and worse. When
that
you're a
was a
teenager,
widely
it's almost what
many
they're
hundreds of
doing your
years.
dangerous no. And if it's more
Hopefully, we'll get
noise enters your and you can't
so
hear
that's a
it,
very
but
quick
no
look
car.
at
And so you go kind of maybe choose a teacher that is cramped. Parents want you to go in and you kind of wander around. And then you enter the work where all that integrated
one of the most fascinating periods, I think, in Jewish history is a brief period of 2 centuries in medieval Spain. It's sometimes called the Golden Age because of the phenomenal personalities that animated the cultural, especially the literary, poetic life of the Iberian Peninsula between about the 10th and 12th century. There's a lot of question, however, as to how golden it was. Series of books over the last decade or so come back and forth on this. So I thought I should very quickly give you a sense of when was this golden era, why people call it the golden era, and what are some of the criticisms. It was not so golden after all. Okay? I happen to have given 2 lectures on this topic and well, in this topic. In the following lecture, I'd like to just take a very brief moment to speak about 3 of my favorites, actually 3 and a half of my favorites. But I'll put in links below some reference to longer videos in which I explore the lives of these people at particular length. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about the golden architecture. When we last discussed the idea under the control of the Byzantines, who then they converted to Catholicism in 589 and created a bizarre reign that was characterized by a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of questions surrounding exactly the nature of how these decrees were implemented. Have the side to look at and examine the history, but it was a period of remarkable anti-Semitic legislation with like and the imposition of police state to track all kinds of strange things that you wouldn't see for centuries later anywhere in Europe.
589, and 711, which is when the Muslims entered the peninsula and congregated very short order along the very rapid expanse across the southern part of the Mediterranean and the southern Europe as well. We don't get a lot of information about the flourishing of a Jewish Muslim differences or of cultural coexistence of these couple hundred years. But by the time we get to the 10th century, things change dramatically. One of the concepts that comes up again and again in the early stories of this golden age is the notion of the loyal and wise Jewish advisor, meaning Rabbi Rothschild coming to a military ruler who got to manage a rescue Christian population who resent the present and serve as an excellent intermediary between the culture and the indigenous population. They're literate, numerous, they're urban, there's all kinds of advantages to using the themselves have no special connection to the local population, and especially not to the previous regime of Visigoths. So the Jews fit that role very nicely. And over then you see this phenomenon of like a Muslim military leader coming in and needing some local support and infrastructure, and we are there to fill that gap. It's not clear at all that some 19th century historians have argued that Jews somehow betrayed the Muslims, but it is not at all outside of the realm of possibility that when Muslims came in, and as their military advance required them to further to the north, and they had to leave behind a thinner and thinner layer of administration, the Jews were able to staff those positions, control the population, tax them, and so on. So that's probably where we have the functional origin of this connection. Jumping ahead a little bit, of course, is reversed over the next several hundred years with something called the Reconquest, or Reconquista, and that refers to the Christian movement from the north down to the south, slowly pushing the Muslims back out of the peninsula. As you can see in this map here, which covers the period from 914 to 1492, which is of course the Jews, and shortly before that, conquest of the peninsula with the fall of Granada in the south. And as you can see with the color coding here, gradually over the course of half a millennium, the Christians begin to slowly work their way down, with significant consequences for the Jewish population, as we will discuss a little later on in this message. So speaking specifically about the Golden Age, what we're talking about is basically the era from last night to the Revolution. Later, kind of the major figures who bookend this period, and that is from the 10th to the 12th century. The area in which the Golden Age is especially expressed is in the southern region, which is known as Al-Andalus, the Muslim region, and it works within a Muslim cultural ecosystem. In particular, has the poetry and that we associate as being I'd like to suggest, I don't think I've ever seen this before, but maybe I can coin it unless I'm doing it unconsciously with someone else. The Silver Age, followed, not nearly as amazing as the Golden Age, but there were a few really important figures like Nachmanides or the Rothschild, some phenomenal figures who were in Spain shortly after the Golden Age was coming to a close, and they Christian cultural people. We're quite a different experience in many ways, as God willing we shall discuss as we go further along in the semester. So basically, that's what we're talking about. There's 200 years between the conquest of the peninsula in 711, it really comes to its golden period in the 10th century, up until the 12th century, when the Reconquista begins to slowly make its impact on this fascinating period. Okay. Now, what makes it so golden? Perhaps one of the most significant things is something that is known in the scholarly research as la convivencia, whereas I think the Spaniards would say la convivencia. I always make idea that these are, very diametrically opposed cultures in so many ways. I mean, Muslims, Jews, they have a lot to argue about, and they did argue in many ways, and there was a lot of violence involved in the history between those three parties. But for some reason, during those 200 years, there was a tremendous amount of a living togetherness where they cultures in ways that we don't see much of the year. There's certainly several key examples of this convivencia, which is not a perfectly round convivencia with Jews, Christians, and Muslims all sharing equally. It tends to be lopsided towards Muslims in terms of political authority, for example, towards the Jews in terms of fiscal activity, let's say. And the Christians are probably at the bottom end of the triangle, but nevertheless, it does represent a step forward. Now, there are a lot of questions about it. Was it really as great as we will describe in the next video in particular? First of all, we should understand that one of the reasons why this happened at all is because Spain is so far away from the center of Muslim culture, which was in Baghdad, right? In fact, in many ways, the Spanish Caliphate, the leaders of the Muslim society in Al-Andalus, declared themselves a separate and independent caliphate from the caliphate that was based in Baghdad. They were so far away. I mean, we're talking about distances that took, days, weeks travel. And so it was kind of like being in Vegas. And what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. There's a lot more flexibility because they were so far from central authorities and they could act independently in many ways. That's why you see many times a kind of relaxation of Muslim Orthodox, such as, for example, alcohol, which was a very big part of the kind of salons that would be held where Muslims, Jews, and Christians would get together and play poetry and of wine. This was something that you wouldn't see happening in Baghdad. There was an element of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The supervision of Orthodox Islam not have the same kind of impact as you would have in the center. There would be ups and downs to this. North Africa from much more doctrinaire Muslims who would insist on a return to some of those values. But for the golden era that we're talking about, a lot of center issues were very significant. And by the way, they also because their center of gravity intellectually was still in Mesopotamia with the great academies of Sura and Pompedina themselves moving to Baghdad. The Geonim were based there as well. They're very far away from the central authorities too. Let us not forget as well that although when we speak about this convivencia, it wasn't like a situation where we're definitely to authority. There were phenomenal figures who were great, but always subordinate to Muslim rulers. No question that somehow there could be many Jewish figures like that. And so there was some kind of boundaries on Jews and on Christians. Nevertheless, placed within the larger context of what Jews were allowed to do in Muslim lands and what Jews or Muslims were allowed to do in elsewhere. Usually appear with and flourishing cultural activity. There were also moments of violence in this period. Let's not think that this was one of uniform peace and happiness. There was a rather remarkable pogrom in the southern region in 1066 after the death of a very important figure named Orhan that we'll discuss in the next video. His son, who succeeded him, was unable to live up to the expectations of the larger population, and there was a degree of popular on him who was but it just illustrates that we can't
view this period entirely through rose-colored glasses. And finally, one of the most striking examples, perhaps, is the plight of Maimonides. He is often was a native of southern Spain. He's often considered one of the great exemplars of Lutherans. In reality, the vast majority of his work, his scholarship, his activity as a Jewish leader occurred in Egypt as an adult and as an older individual. The period of pain was fairly brief. His family fled when he was still a young man, primarily because of Muslim persecution from those North African invasions that occurred at the time. So this is just kind of like caveats to the overall idea of convivencia. Next video, we're going to look at several figures who embody the ideas of convivencia. Finally, I'd like to give you just a little bit of a historiographic perspective on the reason why we get to this concept of the Golden Age in the first place. I wanted to ask you not so much with the sense to the 12th century, but the 19th century, specifically Germany in the middle to late 19th century. This is the period when Jews were arguing quite strenuously for equal rights, for what was called emancipation. Many of the themes that God willing to speak about much more in this next semester. One of the important historians of the era was one of the first major encyclopedic histories of the Jews that has been translated incidentally into a 6-volume edition at the turn of the 20th century. And it was the bar mitzvah present par excellence for decades. At any rate, in that context, in Europe in the 19th century, you see that Jews have been emancipated in France already 50 years prior, in the late 18th century. Tried similarly in England and Austria, without all kinds of things were indicating that Jews were getting more and more right. Germany was not yet unified, so there was a patchwork approach to how Jews should be treated. There was also that revolution in 1848 that for a moment swept away disabilities and then come back down again. So Jews in Germany were trying very hard to make the case that they should be emancipated as well, granted equal rights, equal access to colleges, universities, equal access to professions, and things like that. And one of the things that was part of their overall actual strategy was look at Spain from the 10th to the 12th century. Look at what happens when a society uses more freedom. Jews suddenly are able to make phenomenal contributions to the society. They're able to express themselves culturally. They're able to express themselves in literature, in science, in diplomacy, in military, all kinds of areas where untapped resource that are going to waste because of the artificial disabilities that are placed on them. So by sort of elevating the Spanish Golden Age and the noble Sephardic ideal, the 19th century historians really tried to create an image of perfect society as a model for 19th century Germany to follow. The historical reality has a lot to say in support of that model, but as I tried to outline here, there are some major caveats that take away from it. At any rate, now that we have a sense of why it's a golden age, next video, let's look at 3 figures, 3.5 really, that exemplify the period, and you'll see why it's really fantastic. Thank you very much for watching. In the previous video, we talked a little bit about the structural features that made the Golden Age so golden, and we talked about some of the questions about exactly how golden was it. In this video, let's look at actually 3.5 or 4 figures who exemplify
the golden age. So fantastic. Are approximately 910 to 9. Really an example of the rise that we saw a little bit ago. Fascinating story that actually you see a couple of years where he is drawn to political authority because of his literary ability. He was, like many other figures of the doctor, there was a long historical association of Jews with medicine. While before that, it is a field that has that is a portable profession. You can be a doctor anywhere, not tied to land, which sometimes has the disadvantages of land ownership in some places, and of expulsion lead to losing all the time, things like that. So Jews have been associated with medicine for many, many centuries, and multilingual qualities of Jews being conversant with Hebrew, frequently with Arabic, and Latin, or other languages which are able to and being a doctor was something we see among many prominent Jews at this time. Although that's not where he was especially famous, it was one of the areas in which he excelled. He was even invited to treat the prince of a neighboring Christian country for weight loss. The country was quite overweight, and Hassan was one of the earliest diet doctors who was able to shrink his weight down significantly in that country, increase fame. He was also known for having discovered the secret ingredient in a long-lost medical potion, a panacea really, that was just one pill called teriyaka. And although it's been lost since then as well, there was this idea that if you could just make this one perfect medicine, it would cure everything, kind of like aspirin for everything. I always the term teriyaka sounds a lot like teriyaki, and that connection with food, as you know, is something that I know a lot about. Anyway, he's drawn to political centers primarily because of his literary quality. The story goes, and again, it applies to several figures, but a servant girl from a local government authority, of course, is illiterate. She goes to ask guys in running kind of an apothecary shop, and she asks to write letters for her. To him, the kind of idea is that she wants these letters to say, and he writes them in beautiful, poetic Arabic form. Later, her boss finds out letters, turn of phrase, and such beautiful calligraphy. I want to meet this person, so he's brought in and promoted. And what happens is essentially made the minister of trade, which makes him essentially the foreign minister of a southern chunk of the peninsula. And he ends up, for the purpose of international trade, communicating with far and wide. Multiple languages help him. His ability to the literate message helps him tremendously, and his authority expands in this context. He never loses sight, however, of his responsibility to his people. Frequently, he uses his position to quickly defend and battle populations, writing strong letters to Constantinople, for example, writing, on a previous video, letters to inquire about the Jewish kingdom of Khazaria, which is Syrian. As a leader of world Jewry, at the same time as he was representing Muslim leaders in the southern Spain. Now, another thing that makes him especially well connected to the Golden Age is his establishment of a scholarly basis for the Spanish community. Within a shipwrecked rabbi named Moshe, and we find him, because quite often you have this situation where Jews are taken captive in camps, and of course they're shipwrecked and they have no paper, things like that. They can be taken by slavery, and they're sold in the slave market, was a very large phenomenon of Jews pooling their money and redeeming their religion from slavery. So Rabbi Rothschild is redeemed by Chassidut, and when he finds out that Tanakh is quite learned, he's an Italian rabbi, and you know what? And established the yeshiva here. This yeshiva was incredibly successful, and the establishment of this yeshiva set in motion Spanish Jewish scholarly tradition that would become the pinnacle of scholarship in Europe, particularly in areas of very fine texts. Some of the manuscripts, of course, being copied by hand, and quite often there are errors, multiple versions circulating. Because of these errors, they get repeated by scribe after scribe. Spaniards were especially dedicated to the concept of getting the text precisely correct. That required a lot more of their investment in grammar and things like that. By the way, I'm sorry about the image. Those of you who were born before, let's say, 1970 will recognize the connection to the story. Anyway, let's go on. Another example of the activity of the Spanish Gold Age that I find especially perfect in the lifetime of Chassidut and Shabrut is the massive poetry battle that erupted between the traditional Menachem ben Shabrut and the interreligious Rabbi. So the story goes like this. Everyone's big supporter of poetry. There's a strong Arabic tradition that values poetry very highly. Spanish Jewry is heavily influenced by this as well, and there's a massive industry created for poetry. Poets are called in for hire to compose original poems for weddings, funerals in particular, to have these gatherings, frequently of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, who will sit around the table together and drink wine and recite poetry they have composed, sometimes on the spot, sometimes competition. Whose poems are the best? Saturated with poetry in society. So Menachem ben Shabrut composed poetry in Hebrew based on biblical norms and very beautiful, powerful. He was built one of his letters to Chassidut and Shabrut that Judaism didn't poetry from higher his entire life. However, arrives having been influenced in Baghdad by new Arabic poetry. There's a discussion about what's going on, on a grammatical level. Basically, written without vowels traditionally. The vowels are added later, and in fact, it's typically printed without any vowels whatsoever. You have to literally memorize which vowels go with these words. That's just a learn. But there's vowels like ga, for example, that can be pronounced two different ways, and that alters the way in which a line of poetry could be written. So Menachem ben Shabrut said, what if we could apply some of the Arabic rules of grammar to Hebrew vowels? We can make the Hebrew language much more melodic and with poetry much better. So there was a huge uproar that literally led to riots in the streets of Granada. I mean, literally Jews fighting each other, physically foot fights, over whether we should stick with the classical poetry of Menachem ben Shabrut, or whether we should go with the rock and roll version that the newcomer, the Elvis Presley guy, has brought to our society by contaminating Hebrew poetry with Arabic meter. In the end, of course, Menachem ben Shabrut wins hands down. He colors the next 1,000 years of Hebrew poetry. Most of the poetry that Jews love today, songs like Doror Yikra, which is recited at the table on Shabbat, and so on. These are the Arabic inflected Menachem ben Shabrut versions that had huge impact. Even Chassidut ben Shabrut abandoned his support of Menachem ben Shabrut in favor of this new poetry. But you get a sense here of how cultural society was and how literature played such a huge role. It also senses what we've lost in the last
years. Let us move on to another figure. We'll certainly share in the poetic, but a much more military. And 55, slightly overlaps Raphael and Shabbat on the 11th. That he was a military genius, and phenomenal. He served as a Jewish general leading a Muslim army for 60 years. Incredible. Where would you hear of such a thing? Muslim soldiers following the orders of a Jewish general. And this was right to the end of his life. He died as a general. He was never forced out. He never retired. Phenomenal. And he was a ferocious general. He was tremendously successful. We know this because poems are surprising. There's such a range of human experience that you don't find in typical reading at all. He has poems that describe the heat of battle, that hark back to David's poetry in the Bible. He referred to himself as the David of his age. But at the same time, he was actually a tremendous Talmudic scholar. And he wrote a book on Talmud studies today. And I'd like to pause us for just a second and touch on this. One of the amazing aspects of the Spanish Golden Age, and in this context, Maimonides is an example, even though he's in Spain after youth, he's a great kind of how this is. It is highly unusual in Jewish history that you will have Jews who are at the same time highly expert and valued and world leaders as Jews today, for example, and at the same time highly valued and expert in secular fields that are always dynamic. So you have, for example, lots of right. Bill Nagel, Mayor Zalman, some phenomenal rabbis, tremendous contributions to Jewish culture. And then you will have secular figures like Albert Einstein, Freud, phenomenal contributions to world culture. But you will rarely have figures who are very well expert and recognized for Jewish culture overall, and at the same time contributing to secular culture overall. You will not have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is also the Rosh Yeshiva in Lakewood. It just doesn't happen. We don't have those kinds of figures. Jews tend to specialize either in Jewish or, when you get to the modern era, secular. And they excel in both areas. God, there are lots of people who have made their names, who have, their light shines across the entire globe for what they've done. But it's only people like Shmuel Hanagid, who is equally as a general and as a Hebrew poet and rabbi. Maimonides, one of the greatest musicians of the world, and at the same time, one of the most stellar thinkers simultaneously. This is something that is really characteristic of the Spanish Golden Age, and we will see it over and over again. It's so fascinating. But let us go back to Shmuel Hanagid, and by the way, the term Hanagid means kind of like the prince, the leader. It was probably applied to him by Rav Rothschild, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Baghdad. He was in Baghdad. And this recognition of giving his title, Hanagid, was probably both an homage to his political position and to his tremendous scholarship. And we will have this term used, this title of over and over again in many Muslim areas for the leader of the Jewish community in that area. I mentioned that he wrote war poetry, and the fascinating little tidbit is that he would write poems out and would apply them back to his son in
Nevada, and who then wrapped him in a diwan of his poetic writings. He wrote not only war poems, but also poems, love poems. He wrote ghost poems, which is a phenomenon where he approaches something like rappers or and just negotiate these really obviously really political voice. I would have to they carry collections. One is called and it tells us to act in certain ways, but the work was positive ways called cool ways of getting out. Passive aggressive which is by the way is reads a little bit like you never have on mentality and things like that, the book of problems and tremendously successful and moving was one of the sense of you want to read other people in relationships, you can bless them that you can move them in a certain direction by articulating a lot gorgeous. I've translated the word his poem is dedicated to people who feign intellectual capability without actually just effort. So it starts. أشياء لما أشياء ضامن translation about a person who exudes effort and buys money, but his heart remains empty of it's like a brain person he draws lines upon a wall, even 100 of them. When he tries to get up, he cannot. So the idea you need to get a reputation or learn it just by buying books this course buying books on the wall. You have to books to be able to know what's going on. I listened to the last line the phrase they come la kum and you very, very beautiful language move. I really enjoy poetry myself. So stories of poetry you here now I mentioned at the beginning of 3.5 to talk about before going on to talk about it. One of the most fascinating notes that I wish we knew more. I wish we could say fully this is the fourth person, but we only have 3 poems per person. But she is quite unique because she is the only surviving female Jewish poet of the era, and one of the very few surviving female poets of any era in the Medieval period. Her name was Asuna bin Ismail. Ismail was the Arabic name that Shmuel used to describe himself. So many have felt that this might be Shmuel Hanavi's daughter. He does actually refer to the loss of his daughter at one point in his life. Unfortunately, we can't connect these dots completely, but nevertheless, it is fascinating to think that she may have been Shmuel Hanavi's daughter, not outside of the realm of possibility at all. We have those 3 little poems preserved in Arabic, 15th century collection, and let me show you a couple of them. First one here. Oh dear, you think constantly in the meadow. I resemble you in wildness and in blackness of the eye. Both of us are alone and without a friend, and we keep blame always on the evil face. Now, the powerful metaphor here of blackness of the eye is apparently a very common one you find in Arabic poetry, and it is a sign of beauty, that she, like the deer, has dark eyes, and it's a very attractive thing, but nevertheless, with a certain amount of success, expressing her disappointment with the habit that so long. This is the thing that runs so much of her poetry. Here's another one. Introduction of that collection said that, by way of kind of like context, he says she, Casmona, looked in the mirror one day, feeling that she was beautiful and had reached the time of marriage, but that she was not married. She said, "I see an orchard where the time has come to harvesting, but I do not see a gardener reaching out a hand towards its fruits. Youth goes vanity and lives alone. For somebody, I do not wait." Beautiful expression of love lost or love unrequited. That's just an insight into what must have been happening with educated women at the same time as well. It's highly unfortunate that we don't have more examples of it, but nevertheless, thank God we have it. So, Haftar ibn tremendous builder, acted as a diplomat, as a foreign minister, and of course as a doctor. Shmuel Hanagid is an amazing general warrior poet, daughter possibly, Kasmuna. The last figure I'd like to speak about is Yehuda Halevi, who was discussed before when we looked at the Khazarian Empire. He is, of course, famous for his really bold work, the Kuzari, which claims three monotheistic religions that are competing to some degree to as a three-way debate. This is something you could not imagine in Christian it's been beyond the realm of tolerance, whereas in Muslim lands, in particular, as a result of perhaps that's why he could get away with writing it. Anyway, he wrote it late in his life, and to be fair, he did lead Spain to Aliyah to but at any rate, he did write this phenomenal work, which is indicative of the Jews at that time. Like he was also a medical doctor, and it was but he was not able to put together a living as a poet for hire, and so probably at the insistence of his mother, he became a doctor, and he made his living primarily through that. And he had many tragedies in his personal life. Please have a look at the links to the information box on the video on his life and work. But I'd like to also close by just giving you a look at some of his amazing poetry as well. This is a eulogy that was likely recited at the grave of a young girl. We know that he lost a daughter, and just like Shmuel Hanagid did, and with such power that it's not hard to imagine that he wrote this for his own daughter. Unfortunately, the sources don't claim one way or the other, but let's look at it. The translation from Hillel Hawkins' remarkable work, phenomenal biography of Halevi, actually just like an online version of his poems. Have a look at this is my child, have you forgotten the way to your own home? All there is strange beyond your place. Leaving me with, since you're not here to ask how you are, a great cause to you. Yes, this poem goes on, speaking in the voice of the father, later the voice of the mother, speaking in the voice of the child herself, describing how terrible she feels that she was not able to live her life with love, with marriage, and on. The sounds of you have a between and the but he, like Shmuel Hanagid, is willing to go through our experience, love poems, and light-hearted poems as well, and poets. Human civilization, not just individual civilization.
Okay, I hope I can at least some of my excitement about the and I look at the market if you want to see more.
What are some of the cool
Now,
principles of seduction and here to play neuroscience like that have
Jewish life in the Dark Ages. We have to understand what do we mean by this term, the Dark Ages. So it is a term that comes largely out of Western European historiography. For a long time, let's say 18th century onward, tended to view the flow of Western history as kind of like being a really high point, Greco-Roman civilization, and then the collapse of Rome, and especially its backing by the Mongols in the 5th century, it's a real low where you have kind of Conan the Barbarian, not much happening, and no one's reading, and no one's writing, people are very superstitious about all kinds of things, and it kind of sits there until it goes back up again into the Renaissance, which literally means the rebirth. There are definitely some kind of ladder-like steps up from the Dark Ages, the Gothic period, and so on. The High Middle Ages, which kind of goes from about 1000 to about the year when you start seeing the Renaissance, things happening. These ultimately leads to the modern era, the modern era, and so on. But the key element of this very as if the most important thing that's going on in history is whatever's happening in Europe. But in reality, when you look at world history, most of the universe and most of the world was not dark at all. And I think you can say that about the Jews as well, who are at this point not especially wrapped up in most of Northwestern European history in particular. So let's look at what Jews were doing in the Dark Ages. We've seen this map before from the beautiful Barnaby historical atlas. And as you can see, there are really big centers of Jewish activity during the Dark Ages. We're going to kind of taking the traditional view of the Dark Ages, which goes to the fall of Rome, and like let's say 405, 476 were major dates, or century dates, all the way up to about 950, 1000, about 500 years were really dark for Northwestern Europe in particular, not much actually. And it was the collapse of Roman civilization. That means that although Roman civilization is largely taken over by the same kind of Christian culture, although many very significant differences beyond Catholic, for example, would Orthodox almost wouldn't happen until the 11th century, but definitely heading in a different direction. But it's kind of like this second advantage concept, which we talked about. But I got off on a little tangent there. What are Jews doing during the Dark Ages? We've got really huge areas of Jewish activity, which are quite intense during the Dark Ages. You have that large brown circle is the down in Israel. You've got lots of activity. Lots of activity, intellectual activity, the Jerusalem Talmud, with the activity of patriarchs. They are organizing themselves. They are, relationship with the Romans, which is not always easy, with the Byzantine overlords, but there's still a bit of historical data emerging from and then perhaps more significant, I wish the actual circle was more of an impact. But God, oh my gosh, there's so much going on there. The transplanted of Pisa and Suda, great intellectual centers of the Talmud that are all kinds of stuff right up until the century where you get the Muslim advance, and the Muslims take it over, they have way to spoke about it 2 lectures ago. In fact, that's this map. The Baghdadi culture, the culture, kind of like the all the way out through the Mediterranean basin, and has its about all the way out to Cordoba in Spain, Jewish communities. That it's true we have a lot of the Visigoths and so on, but we also get into the beginnings of the Spanish Golden Age. They have their roots during the period known as the Dark Ages. So these two areas represent the light that was coming out of Jewish in particular, and really has a very different kind of picture than what you think of with Northern Europe in the period of time. But neither the Middle East and the Mesopotamia region in Europe. So what is happening there? So the most important areas to be sure are in Italy. There are just not that many Jews living in the rest of Europe. We have tiny, tiny little settlements in the Rhone River, for example, infinitesimal small ones in the Rhine River, and like just little outposts of it. But in Rome in particular, and in the south in Bari and Moria, you have some phenomenal centers of population where they are involved in all kinds of Talmudic work and all kinds of historical work, poetic work. We have some beautiful remains of Jewish catacombs in Rome, in particular, which is essentially the in many ways, as we saw earlier, from Israel proper. So really, and then into this is where there's a lot of culture going on. I think some of my favorite expressions of Roman culture extending towards the end of the Dark Ages. The remarkable work by Nathan of Rome. Essentially, the first play of the time was a brilliant fiction. Because, again, he was working in Latin and working but the texts are in Aramaic and also Hebrew. Secondary material. So Nathan of Rome, who had a family name Anna, meaning the humble man, he comes out of the word referring to Talmud, provides examples of how the word is used in the Talmud, becoming an finding aid, such that, for millennia, century was written the first millennia, many Talmudic scholars use the dictionary not so much to understand the translation of it in Aramaic, but to know where it's sourced from the Talmud, the way they were recorded as well as the Talmud. Great, amazing work. Lots of scholars who are here in Rome and in southern Italy, many of them did later transplant to northern Europe, Ashkenaz, where they would essentially become the out of the and we'll speak about them, God willing, in our next week. That's really hardly on and off in the region of the poetry and the whole concept of we have, not a tremendous amount of historical data about Dark Ages, especially when you move outside of Muslim-controlled lands to European lands. But one really interesting glimpse is a reference that occurs in Muslim historiography to the so-called Rabbanite nations. From the context that they are Jewish, and they are really roaming the world in areas of trade. The term Rabbanite is up to a lot of scholarly discussion. That's why they are called the Rabbanite Muslim historians. Private activity. My favorite understanding of this term is that it comes from the Rhone River, which is central front. You can see here by France here to end up in Marseille. And this Rhone River is a very important waterway that begins in central France and then comes out to the Mediterranean. And as you can see from this map here, dark line indicates the specific routes that the Muslim historiography
describes as part of the destination of these Arabic travelers, and they're selling, they're buying and selling all over, and sort of nodded indicates the extended trade that we know would meet up with multiple. So it's not at all unprecedented to assume that there were all over the world a whole variety of trades as a practice of that map. The Jews are deeply involved in one of the most important trades, which, as you can see right in the center there, it goes from Antioch through the Euphrates River down to the Persian Gulf. This is one of the most important trade routes for the silk trade. Jews were heavily involved in the early silk trade, which was a major reason for the conversion of Jewish ideas, the spread of Judaism, the spread of Christianity in some ways, actually prepared many of these territories for a monotheistic because of these Jewish merchants going on. One of the things that happened fascinating is that the silk trade, especially when Rome was active, the Jews of the Euphrates actually involved in weaving silk, meaning the Chinese, who were the people who were making silk out of the cocoons of certain types of silkworms that grow in mulberry trees, they were the Chinese liked to make their silk into thick and durable cloth. They would Romans, on the other hand, said, oh, no, we don't like that. We want to do a real and something quite a bit more racy. Actually, often took the silk cloth from China, and then they reweaved it, built out the thread, and made it into much more diaphanous cloth that would be sold at a higher price in Rome. Funny little detail. Anyway, the Jews are definitely heavily involved in this international travel. Now, why the Jews? Well, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy or a self-affirming cycle because we have a common language. They have a common legal system such that all bound by the rulings of the Talmud, and they can rely on a neutral, body of who will not judge them by the official laws of the I'm going to get more into that in just a second. They also have a strong co-religionist bond. It is not at all uncommon. In fact, it was widely common right up into the 20th century in Eastern Europe. A stranger could show up in a synagogue on Friday night and say simply, hey, I need a place to stay for Shabbat, and they can be for meals, and have a place to sleep, and then once the Shabbat was over, then they say, okay, here I am, I'm selling wine or silk or whatever it is. Have you got anyone who wants to trade with you? And of course, was self-affirming. So the diaspora of the Jews was actually the foundation of the international commerce that they engaged in right up until contemporary time. There's a long historical tradition. We will the economic aspect of this unwilling and lecture summer or later this spring, I guess. So hang on, there's lots more to say about that. But let's go to the roots of Ashkenaz. So I referred to people which is extremely important when you consider the kind of situation that was going on in real Europe. Now I'm talking about what would be today France and Germany and so on. So we're talking a really weird, backward, pre-Christian kind of environment where they adjudicate trials, for example, by ordeals. Like this is a drawing of the so-called ordeal by water, in which you have a person suspected of some kind of criminal activity. So the best way to see how well they did is to tie them up and throw them into the gas. Right? We're going to boil up this pot of oil and drop the fire and ring in it, and you reach into that boiling pot of oil. You can take the ring out
without being harmed, that will mean you are obviously. And if you are not willing to do it, that must mean that you are guilty. Guys, I would not want to be anywhere near the omelet any day, rules of evidence and testimony and things like that. Please. So, and one last thing, of course, I'm not sure how you felt about this, but there was the trial by conduct or ordeal by combat, where by simply going hand to hand, or probably accurate. I'm talking about what I like it. And this is something that has no basis in some way. So luckily, were largely exempt in Ashkenaz from any of the trial by ordeal. And they were able, even in these kind of really backward, barbarian kind of environments, able to have their affairs treated according to Talmudic law. This was an arrangement that benefited the Jews and also benefited because the traders, the people who brought goods in. We're in a tiny minority traveling up and down these roads, with valuable goods. But if the society cannot support people engaged in this kind of trade, then it will simply stop and will not have the goods that they want to buy. There's kind of investment in giving the Jews that level of legal autonomy. And we see in the Dark Ages, the Jews are granted a number of communities in Northern Europe. It's quite fascinating. At this point, we begin to see clearly as something really formation. This is formal municipal government views that they developed very strong in Northern Europe, definitely has similarities to what was done in Muslim regions as well. Formed for themselves small states in the state at the municipal level, see them expand to a massive level where the reality but it's tiny little communities we're talking about less than 1,000 people are granted in order to large benefit the trade and later as we shall see benefit the tax structure and the tax revenue of the town. Again, I'm going to talk about this now. We're spending talking about using the medieval economy, and this is crucial. What it gives us for now is the possibility of Jewish social independence. That they are, through the legal structure, through their legal economy, able to run their own affairs, create their own social net. Education with, support for elderly, support for orphans and widows, support for brides, all kinds of things to ensure that the Jews are community and contribute to their survival despite the barbarity of the just by way of introduction, I want to give you that background color as we go on about Jonah, and the contrast is to be absolutely.
And, in physics, we talk about entanglement, and we also talk about matter. Matter is opposed by a lot of kinetic energy. It joins together. Particles or matter, etc.
In order to start talking about the Rishonim, we should talk about what that term is. So Rishonim literally means the first from. Rishonim are the first ones. The first ones as well. So you have to go backwards a little bit and learn a little bit of theology. There is this concept in Jewish theology that's actually quite important for understanding how Jewish truth in general works, and it's called the Yodah, or the decline of the generation. This concept essentially argues that earlier generations, from starting with Moses' generation, portrayed by Charlton Heston, regeneration is called the generation of knowledge, that actually heard the first truth of the commandments spoken by God. That was a pinnacle of a kind of spiritual wisdom that was creating generation after generation. Meaning, because they had all had, I'm not going to go into the whole material, but it's important for us to understand. The generation of the Exodus had achieved such a closeness to God from that moment at Sinai that every subsequent generation invariably represents decline. And this decline is not necessarily intellectual in nature. So, for example, when Talmudists are trying to determine the law, the rule is not to go to the earlier authorities, to go to the later authorities, because they tend to have more facts accurate. For example, if you wanted to know the microwave kosher cooking, you would not ask some rabbi who wrote about things in the 19th century, because he wouldn't have those kinds of facts at his disposal. You ask someone that in the 20th century to discuss it. There's a lot more for this, but the intellectual capability of later generations is not questioned. It is the spiritual capability, the sensitivity, the ability to penetrate to the core of an issue that is the decline from Sinai through the prophets, through the sages, and so on. The major people, or major groups that we're speaking about in the text, and the texts of the Tanaim were in Hebrew. So you have a teacher, a rabbi, who would give the lecture, and then a professional human microphone or loudspeaker would then repeat it in Aramaic translation so the population could understand it. And the sages of this generation, in humility, refer to themselves simply as the repeaters, the speakers, the Amoraim. So these are the sages associated with the Talmud from about the year 200 to about the year 500. And Amora may not override a Tana. And Amora does not have the same authority as a Tana because of the decline of the generation. However, there are two Tanaim who disagree, and an Amora can bring support for his argument with another Amora by quoting one of those Tanaim, then the Amora has support for his argument. So they borrow from earlier times to prove later arguments. I know it's complicated, but we have to talk a lot more about how to understand that. The next generation is some dispute over what exactly the several were and when they were, because they blend into the period of the Romans, about a while ago. These are the post-Talmudic authorities, primarily based in Mesopotamia, up until about the year 1000. And now, our protagonist, they're called now the first one. Not first, but you of the fire authority, but they represent a distinct chunk of intellectuals who are writing particular kinds of things, roughly during the period of 1,600. I rounded these numbers off, obviously, but this is the era of the Rishonim. And what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what they did, why they deserved their own name, what makes them so special, and they are distinguished from the later authorities called the Aaronic, literally the after ones, or the later ones. The Apollonians definitely have a very distinct style. It's very different from the Rishonim. I'd like to spend more time about that, but that will get to the fall. Note that they kind of stop at around the year 1900. I think it's because in the 20th century, although there's no real kind of dramatic break between the people who were writing in the 18th century and 19th century, but by the time of the 20th century, there's just people feel like, I can't be that. You can call me an like or like your sources. That's too much. So anyway, these are the big intellectual chunk of time before things were happening. So let's understand what the Rishonim have to do. Well, there's three main activities. They're largely commentators, counters, and codifiers. These three
of activities were especially important in Shon, found them in Chandra. So here's a beautiful picture, by the way, again in the next class. Illuminated manuscript of the Guide to the Perplexed. See, there is a Maimonides on the right, picking up an which is one of the key inventions of the era of the Rishonim, and Rishonim are often pictured holding on to them, their astronomical devices for navigation and things like that. And he's speaking to the students. And notice the work around the outside, which is absolutely fantastic. But anyway, commentary. So, one of the most important figures, one of the people who regarded the rabbi of all Israel, in fact, the acronym of his Rashi, his name is actually Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, Rabbi Solomon, the son of Isaac, but it's also sometimes playfully translated as Rabban Shel Yisrael, Rabbi of all Israel. Brilliant figure, who we will have a case next week when we come to the Crusades, who essentially embarked on a massive fleet of Jewish believers at tour de force, providing a short but decisive and deeply clarifying comments on the entire Torah, the entire Tanakh, the entire Talmud. Massive amount of work that he actually repeated several times. He went through several editions. There are, unfortunately, lost cascades where not completely lost it, but otherwise, we have this guide that takes you through all of the major texts of Judaism in the 11th century. And his style is absolutely enlightening. Children study it because it is so clear and gets to the point of them. Also, his clarity is, complicated things, and he edits down to just 3 or 4 words quite often. It gets across the idea. One of the things that Rashi did is his commentary on the Torah itself, which was 5 books of Moses. People say that the correct way to learn Torah is one figure follows the Hebrew text, the other thing is following Rashi's commentary. I realize how deeply ingrained it is in Jewish study of the text that always following along with the commentator, and there are several too. Obviously, the top is commentators. Elements of his intellectual art was his unawareness that concept was to bring the oral Torah, that is the Yash, the Esoterica, later called the Kabbalah, and bring it back into the text itself, through the commentary. So when you're learning the text of the Torah, commentary, sometimes, really strange, difficult passages, Rashi will say, don't worry, the oral Torah addresses the questions you're probably having, and he'll bring in the brilliant insights from the oral Torah. And really makes the study of the Torah with Rashi a completely comprehensive study of the Torah as a whole. One of the interesting things of Rashi research today is the perennial question. Other than Rashi, Rashi tell us this. We figure out the question of commentators who provide insights into text and make them accessible for his generation and for the time of fresh today as he was in the life discussion. The second major group, which less significant today in terms of people following in their footsteps. There are many people who are too, but are the counters. The counters of the comments. So based on a passage of the Talmud, a passage which is hundreds of commandments,
society.
But these showmen began to say, okay, well, let's take a list. And that's actually provide a list of all 13. Of course, what happens is when you get multiple rabbis working on one problem, frequently multiple solutions, right? Two opinions. And in fact, they all come up with because that's all the same. Then they did no, you're counting something that's not a mitzvah. I don't count that mitzvah at all. This particular rabbi wants to give a garment to he says, here, I'm going to list out all the sons of I'm going to list them in this sequence literally here in the Torah. So when you go to the synagogue every week, hear the Torah read, you get it in your hands, all of the Torah in that week parsha. And that's brilliant. That's great. It really helps you just yourself. But what he does after that is so much more amazing. Well, he looks at an account, and the English translation, 1/15. The English translation is widely today is a 3-volume set. And then he tells you a little bit about how the mitzvah is formed. And then he tells you a little bit about that's what he tells you why that's so valuable because many of the other authorities on really don't think about that. They do think about it, they write around about it. And so the religion goes to the text saying, here is the commandment, and it's incumbent upon us to observe it. Capture on our God as our the Lord our God, right? Tell us to about it. Do it. I'm generalizing. There are a lot of people who say, no, we have an obligation to think about it too. But anyway, the thing provides why these all of them. Not all of the Rishonim agree with his response, but it is absolutely brilliant. We know that it was president a little bit about him and his country, but so he's like what's going on I was in Ukraine. I've identified very strongly and just that outreach. I read an article about it. But finally, so the only reason I stopped reading as much as I can, from the counters and I send them money. I donate as much as I can to help them practically. One of the most important ones Rabbi Rothschild healing all the time. So somebody has to write a book, somebody has to instruct us what to ignore and what to actually pay attention to. So there are things that you can control that justice says that are out there that you could control by but if we're actually going to work with these in a functional way and organize a society around them, we've got to have them organized by topics. We've got to have all the laws of keeping kosher in one place, all the laws of keeping Shabbat in another place, all the laws of, civil criminal law have to be in one place. So the codifier is saying, all right, organize it here, and remember that one thing is debate about what exactly is something and how does it apply under what one product. All of these things are really important. This was big shop or I got two or whatever they are. Or the four which correspond to 4 different they end up becoming a source of tremendous use and commentaries on the code. But nevertheless, they are hugely important. The most important of them for contemporary undoubtedly is Shulchan Aruch. Maybe about building later on in class. So these are the main areas that distinctive functions really involve these things and the limited encounters and all of the Achronim afterwards kind of following their footsteps. Now, at the same time, what's really fascinating to me as well questions and provide answers which are shockingly modern, and you feel like, what is going on here? Where did this idea come from? How come I don't see it in the traditional book form? Among those outliers was not only a commentator and a scientist. There was a creator on the moon. The subject, by the way, is different. Well, some I found compass right, which is kind of early scientific origin curiosity. It was a very poor thing for life, travel, poverty. He would write out his manuscripts and then before he would sell his manuscripts only copy inside and then have to rewrite them on memory to sell them. What about his poverty are extremely exciting, but it also gives you a sense of, wow, this is like so unlike life, so unlike life. Also, his son, also Rothschild, who is not widely studied today, but they were cutting against the grain kind of commentaries on all kinds of issues which are relevant today. And when you study some of these research, you say, wow, this is like if we decided that halacha, the law, all of Christianity is not very, very different kind of possibility. Fascinating for us. Back to the science, I think when we talk about the scientists, and with us, when it outlines on the return, it's hardly a monolithic, singularly orthodox way of the world. We've shown a tremendous scope of different. Okay, I get too excited when I say amazing. Let's look at Maimonides specifically. And he is really special because, among other things, he is the greatest of the outliers. He is so amazing himself as a scholar, as active in all of these areas and many more. At the same time, he was most during his lifetime, especially shortly after his lifetime, so much so that actually were responsible for burning Maimonides' books.
A kind of inner strength, kind of a quiet, that I think needs to be exemplified the icon, very cool, right? And that kind of sense of inner calmness, you're not hysterical, you're not being upset about everything that happens. You have a kind of
here's a sort of modernized version of iconic image of Maimonides that we have today. We have no idea anything like this, but it's like that's the Maimonides. That is his image up on top of which was from the His dates are he was born in Córdoba, Spain. We have to leave Spain as a youth because of the persecution of the African Muslim tribes that started to demand a much influence of Muslim Orthodox. It's put a stop to the excessive fraternization going on between Jews and Muslims. So his family, which had been raised in biography, and over the course of his teenage years, made their way across the coast of North Africa, from one place to another, along the way from Spain to Egypt, where he ultimately settled. He was secular education. He was especially trained in Tunis, where he learned to be a doctor. You mentioned before, go-to Jewish intellectual, there's sort of a trade, especially a well-remunerated trade, so just often at profession, although he dedicated himself during these years of his youth his mainstay of family economically was his brother David, his older brother David, else as well. And Maimonides had to go to work, trade out his position, and he had to abandon his full-time study of Torah in order to support his family. He is, in many ways, paradigmatic and at the same time exceptional. Paradigmatic in the sense that, as discussed in the Golden Chain, one of these really unusual people world for his secular activity, specifically as a medical doctor. At the same time, he exists phenomenal life on all electric for the next 1,000 years. He is so incredibly powerful in both areas simultaneously. That's what makes him sort of like the ideal of Spanish Reformation. That's why I think schools named after him, because you want to and then body that can get the art school. She's like my body, great scholar, and a great winner in the second field. So kind of the image that we're trying to get across with that. But in the same time, it was exceptional. As I mentioned, talked about the Rothschild, his opinion on halacha is frequently ignored by commentators. I should say it is overruled. They'll say, okay, Maimonides did this, but other major figures, the Rif and the Rosh, they didn't do with Maimonides, so we're going to go with majority rule. And Maimonides is that, he approved of things that Rabbi and so although he interesting example, Charles very strongly on his long-standing experience in his family that a person should not receive a check rabbis are watching this. Sephardic congregations sometimes much more exceptional than Ashkenazi. And there are lots of ways to justify it. Like, for example, if a rabbi does not receive a paycheck, or also teachers, they're going to teach Torah. Get paid Torah. Wow, that would essentially sink the business model with so many Jews. That would be terrible. But there are lots of exceptions. The most important one being that if a rabbi does not have another source of income, then he would have to leave off being a rabbi in order to be, I don't know, or something like that. So then it's kind of like given the rabbi and the teacher so that they are able to rabbi and to but that's kind of an unpopular rabbi that Maimonides pulls the Talmud and by the way, I should mention he's known popular among Jews as Rambam or Rambam, which is an acronym of his name, Rabbi Ben Maimon. The Greek term Maimonides means son of Maimon, that would be his father. Okay, so he's paradigmatic, like a Spanish living ideal, and he's exceptional because